welcome to
Let's get it.
the Atheist Roundtable.
That was terrible. Let's do that again.
How's the mic? What you doing? What up with Eddie? Why he sweaty on your noodle? I don't get it. He lost his shit. The whole kid caboodle. Now pause. You alls. Everybody tell him that he's a lost cause. Who's the ass in the hat? Half Christian ass. Always talking this and talking that. And Benji on the epistemology. You got claims, got beliefs. What's your confidence? And is it relevant? Nah. Just Jeff. What's next? What text you gonna put to the test? Put to the test, little troll face weasel on TikTok looking like a beetle juice. And what do you do when a member of your crew sits in a shed with the dead? I don't know what's up. Anybody seen T Jump? Now the newest member of the crew, the TART debut. Here's your preview. It's K Nabs. She says she's the live stream queen. Welcome to the team. Yeah. Welcome to the team.
The Atheist Roundtable.
Is faith a reliable pathway to truth? Hey, yo, Oz, are we going on a deep dive?
Faith is bullshit. Jesus in the morning.
Welcome to the Atheist Roundtable. It's a TART live show. Oz here, just Jeff with me. What's up, man?
Loving it, man. I'm glad to be here.
I'm loving it. That's some McDonald's shit. Mickey D shit.
I can't eat McDonald's, so
Not a fan.
No.
But the only time I'm a fan is when the old McRib comes out. The old McRib, yeah.
it's not much rib.
'Cause
It's just Mick.
that is 100% pork, bro.
I'm allergic to pork as well, so
Oh, that's too bad.
I don't eat it for religious reasons.
That's why I eat bacon. I just kill all the religions. It's like I can now be no part of any of the religions.
Yeah, I mean, don't eat pork. Slavery, man, it's okay, but pork, get that out of there. Can't have that.
But all the other aminals, you can have all the other aminals.
Yeah, you can eat goats.
Goats,
Rats. Doesn't say anything about rats.
Raccoons.
The McRib is a myth.
Just like Jesus. Like Jesus.
Maybe.
So the one or two things I want to talk about is we're going to chop it up with Dave Warnock. He's like, come on, we're going to do whiskey, scotch, and cigars, and we have a little game that's going to be included that will let everybody know the night of, but it's going to be a blast. And then Jeff, you and I, the night before that, we have a little discussion happening.
Mm-hmm.
What is that?
Jesus, maybe. Is it? Is he there? Is he a myth? Is he real? I don't know.
Ooh.
But I will tell you, I'm going to take that debate seriously, or that discussion seriously, and I will reveal my official position on mythicism. Am I a mythicist? Am I not? Find out.
Yeah, same here. Jeff, I just showed them to you the other night, but I just bought 2 more books that I'm trying to have done or completed by the time we have that conversation. And I'm putting as much time and energy and effort into making this decision like you are. And that evening, having those brilliant people on there, I think will help answer any questions that I do have on that. And then last but not least, March 20th. Holy shit. And then literally just like 10 minutes ago, I'll have an updated one for the next episode.
T-Jump can't be in there. That's illegal.
But
This is not this is not. Listen, you're bringing somebody from the triple A's into the big league here.
this is how you learn.
I mean, this is a fighting championship, and you're bringing in a professional boxer. We're all amateurs.
This is how you learn, bro. This is how you learn.
Okay, well, I think we should get a handicap. T-Jump has to take one loss.
Well, then that means he's done.
Perfect.
So anyway, Atheist Cats and GeoSam were the final two that applied on the Google link for the Google Forms, and anybody else that has already, and there were a couple, or you do apply for it moving forward, you'll stay on the list for replacements, because usually when you plan on doing something like this, people drop off, family stuff or emergencies or whatever. So I do want to have that backup list there. So feel free to go ahead and put your name on the list if you want to. And I need judges and refs or mods ASAP.
And refreshments.
And refreshments, yes.
Yeah.
I need those ASAP. So again, if you're interested, email me, austin@tart.live. But that's going to be an all-day event, and it's going to be badass. And the rest of the rules, regulations, how it's all going to play out, I'll get that out here soon. I started working on that today, and we'll get that. I might finish it up tonight, but I'll get it out to you guys ASAP. And already so far, thank you for the sponsors we have so far. We have Pasta
Ted's
Mike
Montana
Productions,
Grill.
Pasta Mike Productions, Ted's Montana Grill, Meeting Forge, and that's Jim Benton's YouTube channel. We'll get his logo and everything up on there. Ooh yeah, and then we have Don Fulman, which is he's the gentleman that put on the debate down in Macon, where we're down there with T-Jump. So he's contributed as well. And then I'm throwing a little money at it too, so we can make that pot nice and healthy.
I'm waiting for the day that we get a cease and desist letter from Ted Montana Grill.
Quit saying our name. But that's the last one. And I mean, it could be, there's many topics atheists can debate. Anyway, we do have a guest coming on tonight that's called into our call-in show several times, and we have a topic that, again, is something that Jeff, you and I have been studying a lot, been talking about a lot. Either you and I are on air, or separate conversations with other people, and that being the resurrection. So Bram called in. We've had great conversations with Bram on the call-in show. I think one time he called in, I think we had like a 4-hour long call just talking to Bram. And I'm kidding, that's an exaggeration. But he's always been respectful and cool, and I've been looking forward to talking to him. And well, without further ado, let's get him on.
That wasn't too much of an exaggeration. It was about 3.5 hours or something along. At least that's what it felt like. Anyway, hey guys.
Yeah, Bram, great to have you on, man. I don't know, you and I have been going back and forth in email, and you're supposed to be on one point. That's the night I missed my flight home from Georgia, and we're going to chat. So it's good to finally be able to get you on and chop it up with you. But before we get started, I know you have a TikTok account, things like this. You want to tell anybody where they can find your material, what it is you're talking about?
Yeah, I have 2 social media accounts. One, I run a Christian apologetics page on my TikTok, which is at Bram Rawlings 1. I can't spell my name. Rawlings is Rawlings, and Bram is Bram. Just to clarify, some people think it's Rollings or something like that. And my Instagram, I mostly post guitar videos, and that's Bram Rawlings without the 1. So.
Awesome. And we just had started to talk about that backstage before we went live. So you're a guitar player, correct?
That's right.
All right. What kind of band were you in?
I'm in a band called it's a funny name, The Manly Hero. We also have an Instagram, and I personally play like a lot of jazz, like Pat Metheny, Wes Montgomery kind of stuff. but my band plays a lot of like funk, soul kind of stuff, kind of
Ooh,
Earth,
yeah.
Wind and Fiery ish. We mix a lot of styles. If you go on our YouTube, the Manly Hero, our we have like 5 songs out right now, so you can check that out.
Hey, I'm just impressed you're out there playing some funk and some blues. That's badass.
Thank you.
Awesome. So before we get into the topic at hand, which we kind of talked about last time you called in, let's learn a little bit about Bram. So, Bram, I know we don't have to get specific, but I know you're in the dirty South, or as Christians like to call it, the Bible Belt.
Yeah, I don't like to call it that, but
I'm playing with you. And what you've grown up in a Christian home, theist home. What brand of Christianity do you prescribe to? What's your kind of your core doctrine?
I go to a Presbyterian church, and I say that church pretty well fits my doctrine. I'm more of a on the Protestant spectrum when it comes to my theology. Um, that pretty much sums it up.
Okay. And do you aspire to, because in our dialogues, you're obviously studied and you take your time to learn. Do you have any aspirations to ever be in the ministry, go seek out any type of degrees in theology or anything like that?
Honestly, I don't know. That's still an open question for me. I like a lot of things, and apologetics and theology and New Testament studies is only one of those things. So I have a lot of options that that are before me. So we'll see how that
Awesome.
goes.
Awesome. Well, whichever way you go, so far our interactions with you, you're a smart guy and very respectful. And I think whatever you decide to do, whatever path you decide to take, I'm sure I'm sure you will kill it and be awesome at it. So let's do this for the viewers. Kind of give them a backdrop. The first time you called, we started to get into the historical Jesus. Then the second time, I think, is when we dug into the resurrection, if my memory is serving me
I
correctly.
think it's the other way around.
Is it? Okay.
The first
Well,
time I called, yeah.
okay. Yeah, because my ADHD brain, it's Paul and I were just talking the other day, and I told him a story, and then the next day I was like, and I gave him more detail. He's like, just yesterday you told me that you didn't remember who said it, and I was like, no, yesterday I didn't.
That and the head injuries.
That's true. I always forget about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and the alcohol.
I don't think that has anything to do with it. Anyway, so the topic at hand this evening, I know, was the resurrection, and that's where we kind of really started to get into some meat there, and we agreed to do it here live. So I know you had mentioned a slide or a presentation. Do you still want to do that?
Well, actually, I don't need that anymore. I kind of jettisoned that idea. Instead, I was planning on kind of giving a few minutes to lay out my argument with the slide presentation. I practiced that, and it took way too long. So my idea was to, before we start going back and forth and getting into the details, I thought it might be good to start with a general summary of my argument, maybe 2 minutes or something, and then we can start picking apart that rather than starting with this detail, and it gets very confused if we don't do it that way. So is that cool with y'all?
Yeah. So as Kay Neves would say, fair enough. Fair enough. So you go ahead and start with your position, your argument, and then we can just kind of go open dialogue from there. That's fine.
Again, this is going to be a summary. I'm just going to, well, you'll see how it goes. So I'm going to be arguing the positive case that Jesus rose from the dead. And before I get into my argument, I want to just make a little mention about my historical methodology. I'm going to be using a tool that historians call inference to the best explanation. And what this is, you've probably heard it before, is you have a set of facts, a body of facts, as part one. And then part two, you have the best explanation for those facts. And I'm going to be arguing that a certain number of facts are true. And I'm going to be arguing then that the resurrection is the best explanation for those facts above rival explanations. So a few criteria that we can use to distinguish good explanatory hypotheses from bad explanatory hypotheses is one, explanatory scope. What explanation explains the most data? Two, explanatory power, which explanation best explains the data with less strain. Three, simplicity, or Occam's razor, if you will. What explanation explains the data with the least number of non-evidenced assumptions? We can talk more about that if you want. And four, plausibility, which explanation best accords with what we already know in other areas. So one more thing about methodology is I use two criteria for saying that something is a miracle rather than just an anomaly. And it's one, the event can't be explained naturalistically, and two, the event occurs in a context that's charged with religious significance. This is what, in my opinion, separates Alfred Hitchcock rising from the dead with Jesus rising from the dead. All right. Let me get into my argument now.
Can I pause real quick?
Yeah.
You said miracle, and then what was after miracle?
I said how to distinguish a miracle from just an anomaly. An event that just can't be explained naturalistically. We don't have an answer for.
Right, and then you gave one more point after that. What was it?
Oh, and I said I gave the two criteria. Did you get those?
I got the first.
Oh, so the first is that the event can't be explained naturalistically, and the second is that the event occurs. It depends on what religio-historical context it occurs in. An event that occurs in a religiously charged context and can't be explained naturalistically is different from than an event that just occurs in a vacuum and can't be explained naturalistically.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. So here's my short summary of my argument, then we can get into the weeds. The religio-historical context of Jesus that the event occurred in my opinion, is the fact that Jesus predicted his death and resurrection. That's something I'm going to give evidence for, and I'm going to try to demonstrate. So that's point one. Here are the body of facts that I'm going to be arguing for that need to be explained. First, Jesus's death. Second, his burial in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea. That same tomb, number three, that same tomb being found empty the following Sunday morning. For his appearances post-mortem to both skeptics and believers alike. And five, this is a long one, so bear with me. The fact, I have to write it down, and I always forget if I don't. The fact that the eyewitnesses of Jesus, both skeptic and believer alike, came to believe suddenly and sincerely, despite every predisposition to the contrary, that Jesus had risen bodily from the dead and was both Messiah and Lord, to the point that they suffer enormously for that belief. So there's a lot packed into that. Do you want me to repeat that? Or we can just go on? Cool. And lastly, above other naturalistic explanations, I think the resurrection stands far above these other explanations in explanatory power, explanatory scope, plausibility, etc. So that's the meat of my argument. We can start picking it apart from there.
So do you want to go down one by one with those facts? So starting with the death?
Sure. Okay. I have a bunch of papers here, so sorry if I'm kind of moving all around. So the first fact I'm going to argue for is that Jesus was crucified, and have 8 points that I think collectively make a very strong case for Jesus's crucifixion. One is that all 4 Gospels report it. Now, I know that y'all don't hold the Gospels to as high in terms of reliability as I do, but we can talk about that. But I think it's important that all 4 Gospels report it. Secondly, this fulfills the criteria of embarrassment, because in first century Judaism, The Messiah, if you read texts like Psalms of Solomon, where they depicted a Messiah who was supposed to come and purge Jerusalem of the Gentiles and free Jerusalem from Roman captivity. Yeah, that's exactly what we don't see in Jesus. We see in Jesus an alleged Messiah who is killed by the very people who he was supposed to destroy. Now, if you're an early Christian proclaiming that Jesus has been risen from the dead, it's going to be that you wouldn't freely shape the idea of a Messiah who had been destroyed by the people that he was supposed to destroy. So in that way, it's embarrassing. Third, we have earlier material, earlier than the Gospels, from the pre-Markan Passion story. And by far, most scholars agree that Mark's Passion story is pre-Markan. And we can talk about why, but I'm just going to let that sit for now. Earlier than that, well, maybe not earlier than that, depending on the dating of the pre-Markan Passion story. We have the Pauline epistles, where Paul talks about Jesus and the cross. We have Josephus and Tacitus, and I believe Josephus was, unlike y'all, I do not believe Josephus was a complete forgery. I believe I'm in line with most scholars who believe that only parts of it were forgery, but the core of it has been preserved in the Greek text. We have 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, and this is an important source because it mentions Jesus's death, burial, resurrection, appearances, etc. And I'll talk about why this is a very important source, because it's extremely early and it's passed down by eyewitnesses to Paul himself, who also claims to be an eyewitness. So we can get into that. But that's the earliest source we have. We can date it to Paul probably received it within 4 to 5 years of the crucifixion, but it was certainly formulated, as James Dunn points out, within months of the crucifixion. Sixth point, I can't do math. Is that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? It's not. Sixth point is that it's not implausible because the Romans crucified victims. And seventh, we have no evidence to the contrary. That's not really a positive point, but it does help. And 8, the primary witnesses we see are women, and this is true not only for the crucifixion, but also for the burial and especially the empty tomb. And I'll tell you again why that's important if you want to get into that detail. But those are my 8 points to defend the crucifixion.
Well, that's just the death, right? We're just doing the death part.
Mm-hmm.
So the Gospels report it. It meets the terms of embarrassment. Mark's story, Paul's story, Josephus, Tacitus, witness were women, and what were the other two?
The very early creed in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, and the criteria of plausibility. Romans crucified their victims.
Well, so you've heard of the cumulative case for Christ, I'm sure. Have you heard of that?
Are you talking about Lee Strobel's book?
No, I'm talking about like the fact that, it's most plausible that he was crucified, resurrected, and this is a true story based on a culmination of all these small facts, that not one fact by itself is enough to prove Jesus rose from the dead, but the culmination of all these things adds up to Jesus's resurrection.
Yes, I would say that. And I would say that the crucifixion is one of those puzzle pieces that makes the whole puzzle.
For me, it's kind of the opposite. I have a cumulative case against Christ. There are too many factors outside that don't make sense. So when we talk about the Gospels report it, cool. Okay, we can take that as it is. We have one report.
I would be careful there. The Gospel of John is using mostly independent material, and it's very likely that John got his material from an independent source. So we could plausibly say, even probably say, that those are two independent sources there, because you have the synoptic attestation and the Johannine attestation.
Sure. So this accumulative thing that it's suspect to me that the death happened. So some of the things that concern me is the fact that the events reported at the time don't add up. So we have multiple events that are happening. The different gospels describe it differently. That's not by itself enough to say that it didn't happen, but it's suspect. It adds some suspicion.
Mhm.
The fact that no one wrote about these events that happened, the darkness covering the sky, the earthquakes, the shroud being torn, the bodies coming out of the ground, nobody wrote about that. It's suspect. It's a little weird, like it's odd. The fact that thieves do not typically get crucified as punishment, yet we had 2 thieves that were killed on either side of Jesus as punishment. The fact that crucifixions did not typically occur on Passover, the eve of Passover. This is all of these things accumulative make me go, it's a little weird. And then when we look at like Josephus, I don't know if Josephus is a very good reference, mainly because of Matthias, his father. His father was a high priest in Galilee at the time of Jesus. And we have volumes of information about his father. He wrote about his father all the time. And his father never mentioned to him, a historian, about this darkness, about the earthquakes, about any of this stuff. It's suspect to me. It's a little weird. So I think what you've done is found the minimum facts that you need to try and push something through while ignoring the bigger picture that this stuff, it's not enough to add to that story. If I were to give you the same information for another supernatural claim, I don't think you would accept it. I don't think that you would put as much energy into finding a way to accept it. And that's kind of the thing. So yes, I understand the Gospels are a singular account or a multiple account. Let's say it's 500 accounts. I still can't say that we could say that this man rose from the dead, was a god, and was resurrected. There's too many other problems. The guy, the whole resurrection story in general, for it being some sort of atonement for the original sin of man, is a problem. So there's so many other issues I have.
I agree with you there. We're not going to be debating the doctrine of original sin, is that Augustinian doctrine, fortunately. But okay, so I wrote down each of these points, and I think there are a lot of problems with them. Let me try to go one by one. First of all, I hear a lot of you using arguments from silence. 2 that you just brought up were Josephus's dad, as far as we know, didn't write about this.
It's just odd.
Yeah, fair enough. And 2, that if the crucifixion, as Matthew reports it with the graves opening, or as the synoptics report it with the veil tearing, if that really occurred, you'd see other writers write about this. A few points there. First of all, I think that the Matthew's description of the saints coming out of the tomb and the synoptic gospel's description of the veil tearing are very clearly Jewish apocalyptic imagery. I don't think they were made to be taken historically. And what convinced me on that is Raymond Brown's Death of the Messiah. So that's my position on it. We can come back to that right now. More importantly, these arguments from silence, like, Josephus's dad didn't mention Jesus. I think arguments from silence in history are very, very weak for a few reasons. I think they involve conjecture on 3 points. One,
Can I say something about that before we move forward?
Yeah, go ahead.
So an argument from silence in history, yes. But we're not debating the history of Jesus. We're debating a supernatural claim. And I think that there's a different level.
Claim.
Well, the resurrection of a man is supernatural.
Sure, but that's where it intersects with history. I'm claiming that event is historical and it's also supernatural. So we're doing both and, not either or.
Do you have something to say, Oz? I saw you unmuted. Why are your eyes doing that?
Because I'm just listening to you two. But I would argue, though, that if the argument from silence is weak, then I would also say the argument that's always used on embarrassment, and especially in the Gospels, it'd be equally as weak in this format. So it would, if we're going to throw needles at, darts at it, we have to be fair across the board. So if we're going to say silence is weak, I would say the embarrassment is weak as well, especially when it comes to when people point out there was women there. Well, I mean, it was his mom, and a lot of people say his girlfriend or whatever, so.
Yeah. Well, I would really disagree with you there. I guess to show you why I disagree with you that an argument from silence, generally speaking, is weaker than an argument from embarrassment, or not from embarrassment, an argument from the criteria of embarrassment. What the difference is there. I guess let me start by describing why exactly I think the argument from silence is weak. So it involves conjectures on not one but 3 points. First, that if the event occurred, the writer would know about it. Fair enough. I mean, that doesn't involve too much conjecture. But here's where I think that the argument of silence, from silence, sorry, kind of dies. It also involves conjecture that, 2, if the writer knew about it, he or she would care to write about it. And 3, that if he or she wrote about it, that we would still have his or her writings surviving today. And on 2 and 3, let me explain those more. So on point 2, that if the writer knew about it, he or she would care to write about it. We have really surprising examples in history of writers neglecting to mention something that we would think would be important. Let me give you a few examples. First, no Greek, and this is, by the way, is from Tim McGrew's article on the argument from silence. It's highly recommended. So first, no Greek historian of the 5th century BC, including Thucydides and Herodotus, mentions the city of Rome or the people of Rome. Eusebius, in his biography of Constantine, doesn't mention the death of his son Crispus or his wife Fausta. Ulysses S. Grant doesn't mention the Emancipation Proclamation in his memoirs. And here's an interesting example. Neither Pliny the Younger nor Suetonius mention the destruction of Pompeii in their descriptions of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. The first mention we get of these destructions is from Dio Cassius, a century after Pliny, and his account is full of fantastical embellishments. Yet we know that these cities were destroyed because of archaeological evidence. So the cities were clearly destroyed. We know that from archaeological evidence. But Pliny the Younger, in his letter to Tacitus about 25 years after the fact, doesn't even mention that Pompeii, a big city, was destroyed, nor does he mention that Herculaneum, a very rich city, was completely demolished. And his account of Mount Vesuvius' eruption is pretty detailed. Let me give you one more example. The works of Thucydides aren't mentioned by Aristotle or Xenophon. The first mention of his work comes from Polybius 250 years later. So on point 2, that involves conjecture, which I don't think we have a warrant for. And I don't want to get in a monologue here, but let me go to point 3. This will be short. That if he or she wrote about it, his or her work would have survived for present-day historians to notice. Most of our works from ancient history are destroyed. We only have Papias preserved in 2 fragments from Eusebius in the, I believe it's the 4th century. That could be, or 3rd century. I can't remember. But the point is that how do we actually know that Josephus' dad didn't write about Jesus?
I have a question.
Okay.
Why is your God limited to the same thing that limits every other historian?
He's not.
Then why did we only have the same evidence that every other event of similar nature has? Why would this God that could give us evidence seemingly destroy the evidence and remove it to hide it from us? Why play games with a most important event? Like, why leave it up to this very deep dive to where you have to go through this monologue to prove such an event with the same amount of evidence that you're arguing has been given for other historical events that are small in scale, like small as far as of the amount of resources that we have to understand them? Like, why would you leave it up to that little? If you were to send a message, if you're God, you're sending your son to die for the atonement of sins, you would, if you're all powerful, you would have had to either actively remove evidence or allow evidence to be destroyed over time that was around. And that would be the same as any other historical event that has happened in antiquities. And therefore, it makes that event equal with other events in antiquities. Why not make your event special? Why not make the evidence a little bit stronger? Why not leave those documents?
Yeah.
It's interesting to me when I have someone give me an argument, because you're very well versed on antiquities and how history is found and all these things, but you're putting human limitations on what God chose to do.
Okay, so I believe. Well, just let me comment on that real quick. Then I'll go back to your first premise and why I reject that. Human limitations on what God chose to do. No, I believe that I'm using logic and inference, which are both gifts from God that He gave us to learn about Him. So, as a Christian, I have no problem there. Realize that this is not a historical argument. This is a philosophical argument. Um, it involves assuming that if God existed, He would preserve the text in this way, and I don't know how you would support that.
Well, no, I'm asking. I didn't say that it's not true because you didn't support it.
Oh, okay.
What I'm saying is, why take such an important event, something that should be absolutely paramount to the Christian religion? It's the most important event in all of human history, really, and leave it up to the same level of evidence that we have for other historical events that are very minute. It's a very small amount of evidence. There should be pages and pages and piles, like the darkness, Josephus accounts, many other accounts. Like there should be a blanketed amount of information that we should have about this. Why leave it up to such a small, layer of evidence?
So really what this brings is the question.
I don't want to interrupt. I'm sorry to interrupt. I want to get this point out before I forget.
Sorry.
A lot of your argument has been, hey, look, this is enough evidence because we have these other historical claims that also have this amount of evidence. So we don't need more evidence because here's what we have. And here's another historical event where, this works. Why leave it up to this, very minimal facts? It should stand out. It should be special. It should be different from other events in antiquity. It should be the most supported event in antiquity. And that's where my problem is understanding it as a non-Christian is why are we even having this debate? Like there should be no debate is the most important thing.
So, I reject your first premise. I don't believe that there's just as much evidence for the resurrection as there is for other historical events. In fact, I believe there's much more than many of the things we accept as historical.
Secondly, for the resurrection or the crucifixion?
Both.
Okay.
Secondly, I don't accept. Let me trace back a little bit. The fact that you said I brought up a monologue, that wasn't about trying to defend the scarcity of evidence we have for the resurrection. That was about me trying to destroy an argument from silence. That's it. That was an objection to your objection.
Well, it's not. I'm not saying that. I'm not making an argument from silence. I'm saying it's suspect. It's weird to me. I didn't say it didn't happen because no one wrote about it. I'm saying it's strange to me that such an event, which is extremely important to the story of Christianity, to the Christian God, that if the Christian God was true, I need help understanding why it would be left up to you having to debate it, and that I, in goodwill, searching for the information on my own in good faith, would find evidence to the contrary or not enough to convince my mind that this event happened. It should not be left up to chance, it seems.
Yeah. Okay. Again, there's a lot to unpack here. Let me make a few points. I'm going to actually put these in bulletin. So let me back up to what you said before as well. You said, why does it have to be a minimal facts argument? I think you're misunderstanding why we Christians use a minimal facts argument in debating. That's actually not us saying, look, we only have this scarce amount of evidence, but even that is good enough to say that there's a resurrection. No, we could put in much more evidence. For example, Lydia and Tim McGrew use a maximal facts argument. We use a minimal facts argument as actually a concession to unbelievers so that they can see that the facts that we're arguing for are supported by the majority of scholarship, from atheist to agnostic to Christian, etc. That's the meaning of a minimal facts argument. It's not us saying we only have this. It's not us saying we only have these small amount of facts, but even that is good enough to produce a resurrection. It's us saying this is all we need to prove a resurrection, even though we have way more we could use. So
if you have better, then use the better.
I'm not using a completely minimal facts argument, actually. Not like
I'm just saying, like, give us the best facts, like, the ones that are most convincing. We don't have to go to a minimal facts. Let's go to a maximal facts.
I'm not making.
I think we're reduced to a minimal facts because that's what we have.
Yeah, I'm not making a minimal facts argument. Inference to the best explanation is not the same as using a minimal facts argument. If I was to use a minimal facts argument, I would probably take out the empty tomb and some other things, but no. So there's that. Also, in response to your philosophical question, like if God existed, or if the Christian God specifically existed, why would he not make it all the more clear? This is bringing up the problem of the hiddenness of God. And it requires the assumption that if God existed, he would make it 100% clear. And
it doesn't have to be 100% clear. Just, maybe 2% better than something else.
Why? Why is
Why
that
not?
the number you use? Well, I don't know. I know that. I mean, I don't
It's,
know.
it would appear to me then if God chose.
Hold on, just 1 second. I don't know exactly why he does it in every specific case. All I know is that that's not a good argument against the historicity of the resurrection or the existence of the Christian God. That just doesn't make much sense to me.
Well, no. Let's put it this way.
Yeah.
If the Christian God was wrong and didn't exist, what would you expect to be different?
I would expect there to be no evidence for the resurrection, and I don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, think of another God that doesn't exist, like Zeus or Hercules and things like this.
Said Zeus at the same time. Yeah. Zeus.
Yeah. So, we have written documentation similar to the Gospels about Hercules, about some of the attributes attributed to Hercules. You have things like.
Contrary. Can you support that?
Yeah, there's written documents about Hercules.
Let's break that down. Not only how many are there, how many years after the fact were they written? What genre are they in? Is this supposed to be taken as Greco-Roman biography, or did the people read
and therein lies the problem.
No, these were myths. No,
therein lies the problem. Why?
The evidence
again, we're having to do a deep dive to dig through this stuff and dig this apart to be able to figure out if this all-loving God wants me to believe in him.
Yes,
it's not.
If
I were to do that much research into Hercules, which I haven't done that much, but if I do that much research into Hercules, there are 12 or 13 historians that wrote about Hercules as 12 labors of Hercules.
Well, Plutarch wrote about Osiris in the 2nd century BC, but Horus, but we know Horus was worshipped all the way back 6000 BC in Egypt. I mean, the very fact that historians write about these people doesn't tell me anything. You have to look at the quality of these sources. And I would say that there is absolutely no comparison between the so-called sources for these mythical figures and the sources for Jesus.
Okay, I think that's probably the biggest assertion you've made so far. So what qualifies the sources for the Bible way more compelling or way more convincing than any other historical document?
Okay, hold on. Let me back up there. I didn't quite say that. My argument doesn't depend on the general. Yeah. Do you want me to pull out my bookshelf, Jeff? We can do this all day.
Jeff just likes pulling out books.
This is my reference to Hercules, so if I need to back it up, I need to have it on hand.
No.
Thank you for the super chat.
So, what was your question again? Oh, yeah. What makes the Bible more historically reliable than, say, these other documents about ancient figures? I'm not arguing for the general reliability of even the Gospels. I'm arguing for the truth of specific facts that I think are best explained by the resurrection. And the thing is, here's the thing. The Atheist Cast just sent a chat. I can't look at that right now.
He said he loves your argument and he wants to give you $5.
I'm sure. Yeah. If my argument is correct, that these facts are true, first, and secondly, that the resurrection is the best explanation for these facts, and we can say that the resurrection probably happened, it doesn't matter how deep it doesn't matter how deep you need to dig, it remains true.
Well, no.
I feel like it's just a failure to want to actually dig into it. I mean, what's the problem with having to search for truth? I don't really understand that at all.
Well,
And the reason I'm perplexed is I didn't think y'all would respond that way. I mean, this is not a historical argument. This is a philosophical argument that if God existed, or the
well,
Christian
that's
God existed, he would give us more evidence. And I just see no
well, that's what I'm
reason.
saying. If
Yeah.
the crucifixion for me, one I already I already struggle with the existence of Jesus, and I hate conceding, but I've agreed to concede that part for this. And the crucifixion back then, tons of people got crucified. That's not the linchpin for me. The linchpin is the miracle claim, the resurrection. And we know philosophically that a miracle is the last explanation. It's the last thing we
No,
go
I
to.
would
Yeah.
reject that completely.
Oh,
I could pose
that's
a
consensus.
limited amount of other
No,
options.
that's not consensus at all. That's a Bart Ehrman argument. I don't think it's philosophically supported at all.
He's not the only one I've heard or read say that.
Okay, so
I mean, I can think of better explanations.
well, I would argue otherwise, and that's what we can talk
Okay,
about.
so
later.
here's how we break it down, Bram.
But
Do we
can I
know?
get to that point? That
Just let me
miracle
finish
is-
it with. Yeah,
Oh, yeah,
let me
sorry
finish
about that.
with this here. Do we know that every day people die?
Yes.
Do we know that every day that somebody raises from the dead?
No.
Okay, that's what I mean by that. It's the last. It's the last resort we go to. A miracle or supernatural isn't the first thing we jump to. It's the last thing we jump to.
Not if no. I think there's a problem here. That doesn't necessarily follow. The gist of what you're saying I think is correct. Miracles aren't intrinsically probable, of course not. But that doesn't mean that every naturalistic explanation is going to be by definition better than a supernatural explanation, because a supernatural explanation can in fact explain the facts sometimes better than a natural explanation can. And if it turns out that way, we'd be justified in positing a supernatural cause, not a natural cause.
If we had a way to test and demonstrate that it was a miracle that took place, but we can't do that. So that's where that falls apart.
We can't test anything in history. That's why we use inference to the best
Well,
explanation.
no, but that's what I'm saying. We're talking about a miracle back then, a supernatural claim, which would be the resurrection. I don't know about you, and my dad works in the mortuary business, had for 30 years, and I know that's that's a claim just on my own personal experience. But he's been around plenty of dead bodies, and none have ever like whoop, here we are. And have you ever known of somebody that rose from the dead?
No.
So that's what I'm saying. We want to make the plea that that it was a miracle, it's a supernatural, but we've never seen it. We've never experienced that. So what is that, and how do we just jump straight to miracle if it indeed happened? But then going back to the text, historians and philosophers aren't even there's no consensus there that the resurrection happened. They'll give you that there was a human that lived that was named Jesus. They'll say that, but I've yet to read anything that says the consensus is yes, there was a resurrection.
Well, consensus aside, I mean, I think about any statistic on consensus in New Testament scholarship is bound to be fraught with problems because you have people influenced by their worldviews. But I think according to Gary Habermas, about 75% of New Testament scholars hold to a historical resurrection. That's not part of my argument. That doesn't mean anything. But
only 75%.
Yeah, so we're getting into the philosophy of miracles right here, and I think there are a few problems that are being overlooked. First of all, is the comparison from the we can't assign an intrinsic probability on the claim that God raised Jesus from the dead based on our experience of people naturally rising from the dead, because there's a fundamental difference. One is the claim that God raised Jesus from the dead, and the other is that Jesus raised naturally from the dead. Well, if we're claiming that Jesus raised naturally from the dead, I wouldn't even want to start the argument, because the intrinsic probability of that would be so low as to probably be impossible to overcome. But if we're talking about the claim that the early Christians said that God raised Jesus from the dead, assigning a background probability to that is a little more difficult because it involves the assigning a probability to a free agent choosing to raise Jesus from the dead. And really, that background probability is inscrutable. That's why I don't use a Bayesian probability argument for the resurrection. I'm using inference to the best explanation.
So what?
I would like.
Sorry?
Go ahead, Jeff.
No, you go ahead.
So then what was the, I guess that's where I'm lost then. What was the best explanation? Because that,
Well, as I'll go on to argue, the best explanation for the facts I'm going to try to demonstrate is that Jesus rose from the dead over and above any other naturalistic explanation.
Can I give a naturalistic explanation?
Sure.
Jesus was born an extraterrestrial from another planet, which is why he was born of a virgin and could perform miracles because he was an extraterrestrial. And when he died, he was able to go back to his mothership and resurrect.
That sounds like
the people at the time were confused at what happened, so they thought it was a god.
If you remember the criteria I talked about for weighing explanatory hypotheses against each other, one of them was the criteria of simplicity, and that explanation sounds like it posits way more things for which we have no evidence than positing.
No, it's easy. It makes more sense because he could do miracles. He's an extraterrestrial. He could perform magic and confuse people because he was from an advanced time period and species. You're saying that he was. You're saying it's a less let me finish. You're saying it's less complicated that God sent himself to kill himself, to sacrifice himself to himself, to save us from the sin that he gave us.
Okay. Right.
How is that less? How is that more simplistic than him just being an alien from another planet?
My argument does not depend on any one atonement theory. I'm not talking about why Jesus came. I'm talking about.
Well, you said the story was less complicated. I find it to be more complicated. For God to have to send himself to kill himself for us is more complicated than him snapping his fingers and saying all is forgiven. That would be a simpler option, yes?
No, because I'm not.
So that would be the correct answer then, because it's simpler.
Not at all, because I'm not defending an atonement theory here. I'm defending a historical event, namely that Jesus rose from the dead. That's all. I'm not defending why he came. And
I still think it's more likely that he was an alien from Mars, because it's a natural explanation. We know that life exists. We know that life could exist on other planets. We know that there could be a more advanced species. We know that people are easily deceived. So it all fits within a natural explanation. It is also less complicated. It would require less work. I don't have to think that this all-knowing being sent himself to then raise from the dead. Like, that's just, it's extra work that doesn't make sense.
You don't have to bring in all these theological explanations to explain why Jesus rose from the dead. My explanation is not that Jesus rose from the dead and as a substitute to die the death that we should have died because of our sins. My explanation is that Jesus rose from the dead. That's it. So you're comparing.
But let me get this straight. If Jesus rose from the dead and was a normal person, would that be special? Would that be worth talking about today?
Special, yes.
Okay, and do you think that it would be something that's equated to our eternal salvation? Like, is it that important?
That has nothing to do with my argument.
Well, it does.
No, it doesn't, because I'm not even defending the truth of Christianity here.
So what you just want us to believe that Jesus was a man and came and rose from the dead?
Sorry?
You just want us to believe that Jesus was a normal man and rose from the dead?
I want you to believe that whoever Jesus was, he rose from the dead, yes.
Okay, so we're dropping the God stuff.
I never brought in the God stuff.
Okay, well, I'm just saying, so you don't want us to talk about the God stuff?
No, because I don't think it's terribly relevant. I don't
to
make my case, and I wouldn't.
Noted. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're focusing on Jesus raising from the dead.
That's right. I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear at the start of my presentation.
No, I'm just trying to clarify and get down to that point, where we can say it. So Jesus rose from the dead. We're not talking about the God stuff.
Exactly.
Okay. I think that makes it easier.
Yeah, it does, and it also makes it more simpler, doesn't it? It's much.
Yeah. So let's talk about this event then. That's not let's not bring God into it. How does a human body raise from the dead?
No. When you say, we would have to posit a supernatural cause.
Okay, so now we do need to talk about the God part.
I thought you meant that we were talking about that Jesus was God and his atoning death and stuff.
I mean, however you want to phrase it, like how did a human body raise from the dead?
Supernaturally.
Okay, so through God claim.
The historian can come to the conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead while remaining agnostic as to its cause.
What you're using the cause as part of the explanation.
No, I'm only using the cause as a possibility to show that a man rising from the dead is not necessarily low in prior probability.
But you're claiming that this event happened as a supernatural event, and you're leaning on that supernatural ability being that God did it.
If you remember the two criteria I gave at the start, one, that the event can't be explained naturalistically. I would argue that that's the case, or explained adequately naturalistically. And two, that it occurs in a religiously charged context. And the religio-historical context I talked about was that Jesus predicted his death and resurrection. So once you take that historical context, I think that shows us that it was a miracle. The historian, as a historian, can remain agnostic as to the cause of that miracle, but he can still say that Jesus rose from the dead. All you need to do is show that he was dead and that he was alive.
But that's the thing. We can't do either. We can't show that. You can believe that.
Well, no, I believe we can demonstrably.
Okay, so that's what exactly I want. That's what I'm wanting. So Jeff and I'll shut up. We want you to show us, because it's not something I just believe on a whim. I want you to show us that this guy was here. He was crucified on a cross. He died, and then came back.
Okay, that's what I was trying to do.
Okay, well that's what. Let's rewind it. Go from the top. And for clarity, the inference to best explanation. What I'm hearing though is it's that with a mixture of however you say his name, Habermas, and the thank you, Habermas, and the minimal facts. I feel like there's a blend here. We're kind of blending them together, which is not a problem. I don't have a problem with that, but I just want to make sure we're dealing with the same argument here. At the end of the day, we currently don't have a good reason to believe that any of this happened, especially if there's supernatural mixed in. So we'll shut up, and then you do your thing.
Yeah. By the way, Habermas does use inference to the best explanation. What distinguishes my argument and Gary Habermas's is that I don't go to the minimal facts. I don't do a quite maximal facts argument either. But I'm just not going to the bare bones here. So just to make that clear. So we kind of took a tangent there on the philosophy of miracles and arguments from silence, etc. But so I presented my 8 points for why I think Jesus was crucified. Jeff's objected, well, the things in the accounts, like in Matthew's, where the saints are coming out of the tomb, are very implausible and strange. I said that's probably apocalyptic imagery, and I think we can plausibly say that. It's reminiscent of things that happen in like 2 Kings, for example. He talked about Josephus' dad not mentioning Jesus. I said that's a fairly poor argument from silence. Are we okay to move on from Jesus was crucified? Because really we cool? All right, cool.
Yeah, because that part.
I'm not saying y'all agree with that, but just so we can move on.
Yeah, because that part to me is really the irrelevant part. Because people back then were crucified all the time. I want to know how this son of a bitch got up from the dead. That's what I want to know.
Yeah, well, you have to show that he was dead before you could say he got up from the dead. That's all I was trying to do. But
there was cocaine in the tomb.
All right. I'm going to go next to the burial, which is important because if you have an empty tomb, you have to have a tomb to start with, and it has to be the same tomb. So that's why I want to argue for that Jesus was buried in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea.
Do we know where the tomb is?
Today, I'm not sure, but
Okay.
I do argue that.
But you think that tomb existed?
Yes, absolutely.
How do you know the tomb existed?
I'm about to argue these points. So the first evidence we have, if you remember, I mentioned that 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8 creed, which is a charismatic summary of Jesus's death, burial, resurrection, appearance, etc. to the eyewitnesses, and I argued that it was formulated within months of the crucifixion, and that's the first argument I would make for Jesus's burial. It says that he was buried. That verb thopto, when Jews used it, they always meant burial in a tomb. So that's the first thing. Secondly, it's plausible. We have other examples in literature of that from that time that are not Christian that show that Roman burial practices sometimes did allow for Jews to take down bodies from a cross and put them in their tombs. One example of that is Josephus in his the Jewish War. He says, the Jews are so careful about funeral rites that even those who are crucified because they were found guilty are taken down and buried before sunset. And as Craig Evans points out, only Romans had the power to crucify in Judea and Samaria, and the Jews are the only ones burying, because this is a clear reference to Deuteronomy 21, which is what the Jewish people followed in their Mosaic law. And this in Deuteronomy 21 verses 22 through 23, I believe, it's God is telling his people not to leave a body on a tree overnight and bury it before sunset. And what that meant for Jews in the first century Rome and Jerusalem was that you would take down the body from a cross, a Roman cross, and bury it in a tomb. Secondly, sorry about that. Secondly, we have archaeological evidence. We have discovery of the bones of the crucifixion victim Johann in the Jewish ossuary in Jerusalem in 1968. So we have an example of a Jew being buried that was also crucified. Another point. Joseph of Arimathea is mentioned in all four Gospels. And I'm going to argue that his existence, that he actually existed, and that's important. So I think Raymond Brown, the New Testament and early Christian scholar, expresses this better than I can. So let me quote him. This is from his large commentary on the Passion narratives called The Death of the Messiah. First quote. The very fact that later Gospels had to ennoble Joseph and to increase the reverence of the burial given to Jesus shows that Christian instincts would not have freely shaped what I have posited for the basic account. That the burial was done by Joseph of Arimathea is very probable, since a Christian fictional creation from nothing of a Jewish Sanhedrinist who does what is right is almost inexplicable, granted the hostility in early Christian writings toward Jewish authorities responsible for the death of Jesus. So this is really an argument about the criteria of embarrassment. He's arguing that, and I agree with him, the early Christians with a hostility toward the Jewish Sanhedrin would not freely invent a Jewish Sanhedrin member to do what is right by Jesus and bury him in a tomb. And that's why, as you see the Gospels progress and as time progresses, Joseph becomes less Jewish and more Christian. His Sanhedrinist past is completely wiped out. And third point or fourth point, I can't quite remember. We also have women as the primary witnesses in this. And I'm going to be talking about the women more when I talk about the empty tomb, because that's where they're most prevalent. Anyway, so that'd be my argument for the burial. It'd be very early attestation from that early creed. Plausibility. We find this sort of thing happening elsewhere in the Roman Empire with Jews, and from the criteria of embarrassment, that the Christians would not have freely invented Joseph in their story to bury Jesus. Do you want me to go on, or do you want to discuss the burial?
Well, I'll just say a couple things that I think I've already said, just to as a reminder. I already said that there was many people that died via crucifixion back then. So finding a or even multiple bones or anything archaeological that would demonstrate that's really that means that doesn't mean anything. I mean, we know that happens all the time.
Yeah, not by itself.
What's that?
Yeah, it wouldn't mean anything by itself, but I'm just using it as one piece in the argument.
Well, but you're trying to chain it together as part of the argument.
Exactly.
So to me, that you can for you, but for me, that means nothing. Is what I'm saying in the argument.
It'll mean something when I get to the empty tomb, because I'm going to be arguing that the same Jesus that was buried in this tomb came out of that same tomb. So that's what's important for now.
Okay, so did we find these bones in that tomb?
Jesus's bones? No.
Okay, so that's what I'm saying. Those bones mean nothing to me.
No.
That's
I think you misunderstood what I was saying. I argued that it was very plausible, which means that it accords with what we know about Jewish burial practices in the Roman Empire. And the reason I brought up the crucifixion victim Johann, who was discovered, whose bones were discovered in Jerusalem in 1968, was to show that this stuff did actually happen. That this is not, that the Gospels weren't being anachronistic when they talked about Joseph burying Jesus. That's all I meant. And that's why I brought up Josephus as well.
Okay. Oh, I love it when Christians bring up Josephus. But Jeff, anything from you?
I concede my time.
All right, let's get what's your next step?
Empty tomb. This is where it's going to start.
Yeah, let's get it. Go ahead.
Yeah.
I'm on mute.
All right. So I have, let me count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 arguments for the empty tomb. So the first argument for the empty tomb is the famous women at the tomb argument. And remember, this also applies to the crucifixion and the burial. But the Gospels portray the women as the primary witnesses to the empty tomb, and which is strange, given first century Palestinian Jewish views of women and pagan views of women, by the way, because in Josephus reports that women weren't even allowed to testify in court. The pagan Celsus in the 2nd century makes fun of these makes fun of the church father Origen for believing these empty tomb accounts because they were told by silly women. That's his quote.
So we're at least, I'll jump in. We're at least going to double down and agree that the Bible and its God is and its characters are maybe a little misogynistic, a little bit.
The Bible is doing exactly the opposite of what you would expect. But actually, I have an example. Paul. Let's talk about Paul. Paul maybe this isn't Paul. I don't know who wrote 1st or 2nd Timothy. Maybe it wasn't Paul. But Paul seems to reflect this common view of women as not having good testimony or judgment when he describes old wives' tales and silly women, swayed by this and that. That's 1st or 2nd Timothy. I can't remember. Also, this is in the gospel. And by the way, this is not a call to bring up the women preaching issue. So there's that. Just so Jeff wouldn't looking that up.
I won't do that to you. Not tonight. Maybe another time.
Another time. Also, in the Gospel of Luke, I think this explains why when the women come and tell the males that Jesus is risen, they don't believe Mary, and they have to go check the tomb themselves. That makes sense against this backdrop of the view of women. Pagans honored their women. No, I use Celsus as an example. Celsus was a pagan, and he makes fun of the church father Origen for believing these stories precisely because women were the primary witnesses. So it's in the pagan world too. All right. So that's the first argument. I think that shows that it's not something the empty tomb story is not something that the early Christians would freely invent if they wanted to, make disciples of all nations. One more point about this. In the early Christian creed we see in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, it starts with not an appearance to women, but an appearance to Peter. And I think what this demonstrates is that this empty tomb story, is extremely early, because it's far more likely that Paul, in passing on this creed, or someone before him, suppressed the appearances to women in favor of an appearance to Peter, rather than they would invent an appearance to women later on. So I would argue, furthermore, that this empty tomb story has to go before this 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8 creed, which puts it very, very early. Second thing, this point is a little more complicated, so please bear with me. The earliest Jewish polemic presupposes the empty tomb. We have good reason to believe that the enemies of Christianity knew that the tomb was empty. So from Matthew 28, 11-15, we can reconstruct the following development of assertion and counter-assertion. First, the Christians proclaim Christ is risen. The Jews reply, the disciples stole the body. And as N.T. Wright explains, this is a quote from his book, if nobody had suggested such a thing, it is difficult to imagine the Christians putting the idea into people's heads by making up tales that they had said. 3, the Christians replied, the guards at the tomb would have prevented such theft. 4, the Jews replied, the guards fell asleep. And I add, for the same reasons, this is also unlikely to have been a Christian invention. 5, lastly, the Christians reply, the priests and elders paid the guards to spread the story. Now, we're going to put aside for the question right now. Well, let me step back really quick. We know that early on, Jews were saying that the disciples stole the body. Now, whether that's a good explanation or not, I'm going to argue that it's not at all, is something we're going to address in part 2 of my argument. But for now, all we need to know is that the Jews saw the tomb, knew that the tomb was empty somehow, and they had to explain it away. They didn't say to Peter, like they did in Acts 2, you're all drunk. They could have made up any story. Instead, they say the disciples stole the body. That presupposes the empty tomb. Point 3, the tomb was known by both Jew and Christian, so it is unlikely that the resurrection preaching could have flourished in the same city, namely Jerusalem. They could have gone to the tomb to check. This is where it was important that I set up an argument for the burial story, because this can be inferred from the burial story. Joseph of Arimathea, a Sanhedrinist Jew, obviously knew the burial site because he buried Jesus. Secondly, as Raymond Bram points out, crucifixion was a public event, and the Gospels report that Jesus was buried nearby in the Gospel of John, which would make sense in the case of a hasty burial. Perfect sense, because Joseph was trying to bury Jesus before sundown, according to his to the rules set in Deuteronomy 21. Another point, this is implied, it's not explicitly stated, but is strongly implied in the 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8 creed. And you can read it here. That he was buried and that he was raised on the third day. Now, let's take each of those points. That he was buried, that verb thopto, to any Jew using that always meant burial in a tomb. So he was buried. It's taken for granted that it's in a tomb. That he was raised on the third day. Clearly, Paul was talking about a bodily resurrection, and we can discuss that later. And so to anybody, any Jew reading this clearly meant he was buried and that his body left the tomb. And as N.T. Wright, says, I like to quote him on this point, the statement he was buried and he was raised no more needs the qualification and there was an empty tomb than the statement I walked on the street needs the qualification with my 2 feet. Last thing, the resurrection preaching couldn't have launched unless there was an empty tomb, because an appearance by itself would not have produced the belief that Christ had risen bodily. Why? Because in the ancient world, appearances were well known to both Jew and pagan, and if these meant that people were dead, not that they were alive. So an appearance by itself most likely would have only produced the belief that Jesus was dead, contrary, just the opposite. But an empty tomb and appearances, which I'll be arguing for later, are sufficient to account for this belief that the early Christians had, that Jesus had remarkably risen from the dead in a body. So that's how I'd argue for the empty tomb. You want me to keep on going all the way to appearances, or you want to stop?
I do have a question.
Okay.
Early you said that the women account that, women went to the tomb and they wouldn't make that up because women weren't trusted.
Not that. The view of women was a little more nuanced than that. It was that women, not that they were deceivers or liars or anything, but that they were kind of swayed by their emotions and all that.
What source do you have for that?
I argued for Josephus and Celsus, and you can also find it in the later Mishnah.
Josephus is talking about in court, though. They're not in court.
Yeah, and that reflects the cultural understanding of women at the time. And if you want to talk about
there's not any other, like the only other references for what you're saying, it come from earlier Jewish tradition. But I don't think that there's any other source you have for this they aren't trusted thing other than Josephus, and that's talking about in court. So I'm not so sure that that's an accurate description. Unless you got another historical reference that Jesus or that women were not trusted.
Celsus, Paul, and Luke.
Because if we were telling the story, the anointing process would be done by women. Okay, so women would be at the tomb. It fits the narrative of who would be there. Also, the apostles could not be there because they had fled.
No, that's it. Okay, there are a few things here. No, the apostles did not flee to Galilee. That's a complete construction. There's no evidence that they fled to Galilee. All four gospels have the apostles in Jerusalem Sunday morning. So there's the first thing. You should the second thing is that you're confusing the criteria of verisimilitude with the criteria of embarrassment. Verisimilitude is how true to life an account is. Yes, the women would have been the ones anointing. That's missing.
They would have been the one to discover it.
Yeah, exactly. That's missing the point.
So then it makes sense that women were there.
No, but that doesn't make it not embarrassing. That's why in later gospels, like the Gospel of Peter in the 2nd century, you have Nicodemus and Joseph discovering the tomb. They could have easily invented men to find the tomb. That's not implausible at all.
But it would be improbable considering what would have normally been happening. So people would not have believed it.
Well, why did they say in the Gospel of Peter, why did they replace the women with men? Precisely because it was embarrassing. So
what are you saying, that account is incorrect?
Absolutely. It's later, and it comes later, and it's has many anachronisms. Like it makes Pilate a Jew, for example. So it's a good example of how legend accrues over time.
So Bram, I'm just a pretty common sense guy, and maybe you're a lot smarter than I am.
I don't know about that.
So what I'm trying to figure out is how you've went through all this and you see a body out of a tomb in game resurrecting, because I'm taking notes, and as you're sharing, I'm reading, and I don't understand how your logic gets you to where you're at. So unless Jeff has anything else, are you going to resurrection next?
Well, let me say this real quick. At this point, if I only had a crucifixion, a burial, and an empty tomb, I wouldn't say we need a resurrection either. I wouldn't believe in the resurrection if I stopped here. But I think we're getting right into where we need to be, which is the empty tomb plus the appearances, plus other things. So we're almost there. This is not sufficient evidence yet, just so you know.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah.
All right, so let's
do it. I'm not arguing that. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's keep moving through, because everything so far, it's like, yeah, okay. It's I mean, some of it doesn't mean I agree, but it's not worth our time for me to push back, because at the end of the day, all this. Oh, even Paul said it. All this is bullshit. If there's no resurrection, and I currently don't have a good reason to believe in a resurrection. But let's get there. So let's talk about the sightings of this guy and keep it moving.
Well, yeah, just I don't think I was wasting our time or anything, just so you know, because I think the empty tomb is a necessary condition for belief.
No, I'm not saying you're wasting, because I want you to be able to lay out your argument. But I also, as we're going along, I'm as fast as I can while you're talking, just reading and going along with you.
Yeah.
But to me, the nail in the coffin or the linchpin or whatever is the last part of it. So.
Okay, cool. So, Jeff, do you have anything else to say about the empty tomb?
I concede my time.
Okay, because even if the women argument doesn't work, I think it does.
I think personally, I'll tell you what I think. You don't have to push back against it.
Okay.
I think that early Christians were looking to explain, because there's the reason that these things are listed out is because the theories of like stealing the body, or all the other theories are being dissuaded here, that they're being explained, and they're being explained based on what would have happened at the time had this actually occurred. So I see it as an explanation by early Christians attesting to what would have happened rather than an actual account of what did happen.
Okay, so as much as I'd like to,
you don't have to push back. I mean, you can keep going with your thing. That's just where I'm at.
I want to stay on track, but fair enough. Let's talk about the appearances. So this is where I really want to harp on the 1 Corinthians 15 through 8 creed. And let me talk about this creed a little bit. So just so you know, this is a pre-Pauline creed. This is something that Paul passed on to the Corinthians. This does not date to the same time that the Corinthian letter is written. That would put it at about AD 50, but that's not the case. And we have a few reasons for believing this. So it's extremely early. It's most likely formed within months after the crucifixion, and a few signs indicates that it's earlier than Paul. First of all, it uses parallelism. You see the repetition of and that, and that, and that. In Greek, it's kai, 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 kai. That is a clear indication that it's a piece of oral tradition. And Paul says, this is what I received and what I handed on to you. So he's passing on oral tradition from most likely Jerusalem, from Peter and James. I'll talk about that in a second, to the Corinthian church. So there's that. It also uses lots of non-Pauline language. For example, it uses the phrase the 12. Paul doesn't talk about the 12 anywhere else. It uses the phrase crap. A few other things. Oh yeah, according to the scriptures, elsewhere Paul says it is written. So that it uses non-Pauline language too. If we lay out a map of Paul's life as we have it in, as it coheres with Acts and the writings of Paul himself, and that's his 7 undisputed letters, not the other ones, we can most likely trace this back to, it gives us 2 options. First of all, it gives us Damascus 3 years after the cross, or it gives us Jerusalem 5 years after the cross. The reason I don't think he received it in Damascus, I don't take the earlier dating, is because oral tradition, these charismatic summaries came from Jerusalem, and Paul throughout his writings seems to indicate that he had Jerusalem. He considered Jerusalem the main authoritative church. That makes sense because that's where Peter, James, and John were. I mean, Peter, James, and I forgot already. Peter and James. And if we go to Galatians 1:18 through 19, we see in Paul's letters that he says he goes to stay with Peter for a few weeks, and he also sees James, who he calls the Lord's brother. And I think that's most likely where he got it. First of all, because it's in James, where the authority to hand out these stories of Jesus. And Paul most likely went to James. I mean, surely when talking to Peter, he would inquire with Peter about very important things. As C.H. Dodd says, he probably didn't go to talk about the weather. So I think that presents us with the best option of where Paul received this creed. So we have it extremely early, and the fact that he received it most likely from two of the eyewitnesses listed in the creed itself. So Paul is getting a tradition about eyewitnesses passed on to him by those same eyewitnesses. And fourth point, this is best understood as a charismatic summary of the early traditions of Jesus' death and resurrection, in part because it coheres so well with other early charismatic summaries. This is where being able to present a screen would help, but I don't think I'm going to do that. I have this chart right here, and I'm not sure how much this helps, especially on screen, but let me explain it to you really quick. So on this chart, we are breaking down the lines of the creed. Christ died for our sins. That's one column. He was buried. That's another row. He was raised. That's another row. And he appeared. Now, for each of these, we have something similar found in other charismatic summaries in other parts of the New Testament writings. For example, in the Passion story. Remember, I talked about a pre-Markan Passion story, how most scholars think that was pre-Markan. We have Christ died for our sins. Mark says, then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last, and so on. And we find this also in Acts 13, 28 through 31. So this is best understood as a summary, not an exhaustive storytelling of the stories of Jesus about his death through his resurrection, but is a summary of these things. So there's that. There's very early and reliable evidence for that. And we find listed.
Is all of this early and reliable evidence in the Bible?
Yes, that isn't. I mean, this came before the Bible. The Bible was put together in 400 years after the fact. So that isn't these. I'm treating these not as inspired documents, but as historical documents. It's to be treated as history, like I would any other.
From Christian writers, though.
Yes, but
okay.
I still think it's reliable.
Of course you do. I mean, I wouldn't imagine you'd be presenting evidence that you don't think is reliable.
Oh yeah. I mean, well, I think it can be. The fact that it was written by a Christian, I think has no bearing.
So, but just to be, I want to boil this down and make it simple because Oz, he doesn't have a lot of. So, so what you're saying is that we can prove an empty tomb based on testimony.
I don't like that simplification. I think we show.
Did you present something other than testimony?
No, I didn't. But I didn't just present one testimony. I think I presented many different arguments for it.
You did, but but it still boils down to what you want me to do is believe. I should believe the empty tomb story based on solely testimony.
Not only the testimony of Christians, but also, as I argued, the testimony.
But testimony is the only evidence that we have of the empty tomb.
As we do for any other historical event. I mean,
we have archaeological findings for other historical events. Pompeii has a method of archaeological evidence. Knowing where the tomb was would be archaeological evidence if we had a singular tomb. Those kinds of things.
Yeah, sorry, but
So we're going based off of testimony.
Do you see that as a problem? Most of what
I do.
Most of what we know about the siege of Jerusalem.
Could you give me hold on. Could you give me one supernatural claim that we believe based on testimony?
The resurrection.
Okay, what else?
I don't really have any others. I wouldn't argue.
Then it's special pleading.
No, I wouldn't. I just wouldn't argue for any others. I don't know if there's evidence for others.
Well, you would believe other supernatural event. Well, how about this? We have thousands. We have thousands of eyewitness accounts for Bigfoot. Is that enough?
No, we don't.
We even know who these people are. We know when they lived. We know their names. You can talk to them today.
Okay, well, show me that.
I would say that that's stronger evidence than you have for Jesus's resurrection. Yet you reject their eyewitness testimony and substitute with your own.
You have to show me the quality of this evidence, and then I'll examine it, and if this is good evidence,
I
then
have
then I'll believe it.
thousands of firsthand eyewitness testimony
How do you know that?
because because you can talk to the people that saw it.
Well, can we? I don't
We can.
know that we can.
I can give you
Okay,
the
well,
names of people that claim to have seen Bigfoot.
You seem to be wanting me to take your
I'm trying to boil it
claim
down.
based on
Here's the
eyewitness
thing, Bram.
testimony.
You're very smart.
Yeah.
Smart people are able to take a subject
Okay.
matter and really divide it up. I am keeping it as simple as possible for Oz and the viewers. So what I want to do is we're talking about eyewitness testimony being
Exactly.
your evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ's empty
Yes.
tomb. And
Not
what I'm
only-
saying is
not
that
only-
that is
not-
not your evidence that you're leaning on. You're leaning on something else because when I give you the same eyewitness testimony for a different event, you reject it immediately.
Except you haven't described this testimony at all. You just said there are thousands. I don't know if their memories were faulty or what. I have
Interesting. Yeah, interesting.
I have-
Interesting.
I have-
Exactly.
I have-
Interesting. Yeah, so let's examine your evidence. I don't know where these people came from, who they are. Can I talk to them?
No, you can't talk.
Can I
about them.
investigate this claim further? Can we use a third party independent resource to necessitate what they believe?
So all this is if all that was really your criteria for believing something, you'd have to
It's
jettison
not.
most of what you believe about history. Do you?
I don't
Okay.
take any supernatural claim from history on eyewitness testimony alone.
What else would you need?
Well, let's say, for example, Bram, do you think I own a microwave?
I don't know your socioeconomic status, Jeff.
But what would you require
know
of me
you
to
can
prove
afford.
to you that I have a microwave?
I'd ask you to probably show me the microwave.
Okay, cool.
I mean,
what
but
if I told?
I wouldn't be irrational in believing that you had a microwave if you told me either.
Sure. Yeah. So I would probably just need to tell you I have a microwave.
Yes.
What would it take for me to prove to you I own a car?
I would probably believe you just if you told me that you owned a car.
Okay. What if I told you that I had an airplane, like a Cessna?
Yeah. So I know where you're getting at. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Is that right?
Similar.
I think that's exactly wrong, actually. I don't believe that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and I think that's actually demonstrably false.
So then what's with the Bigfoot denial?
Well, I'll tell you. If I can find my... Y'all made me scatter all my papers around my desk, and I can't find anything now. The reason I use the paper is because this is a little bit technical of an explanation, and I'm not sure I can recite it from memory. But nonetheless, here we go. So, a claim is only ordinary or extraordinary based on a set of background information. Would you all agree
Are
with
you
that?
about to say that the claim of Jesus' resurrection is not supernatural?
No, I'm not saying that at all. It is
Okay.
clearly a supernatural. But a claim is only ordinary or extraordinary based on a set of background information. Would you agree
Would
with
you
that?
consider Jesus as extraordinary?
Yes.
Okay, so it's extraordinary and supernatural.
Well, it's extraordinary because it's supernatural, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, but would you agree with that? A claim is ordinary or extraordinary based on a set of background information.
I guess it depends on what you mean by what background information.
Okay,
you're
Well,
talking about.
but hold on, whoa. I'm gonna jump in there because that's what you're doing there, Bram. Is that's irrelevant to what Jeff asks, because either the supernatural is an extraordinary event or it's not. It doesn't matter what we have in the background or anything like that. It either is or it isn't.
Oz, it's extraordinary because with respect to a set of background information.
Respect to what?
Okay.
How does that change your criteria for why?
That's just the starting point for how I'm arguing against the idea that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Just starting with that, a claim is only ordinary or extraordinary based on a set of background information. For example, if you told me that you had a microwave, well, from what I know, many people have microwaves. That's not at all implausible. I'm rationally
Exactly.
believing that you have a microwave. If you
100%.
just tell me, yeah, exactly. Now, if you told me that you had a dragon in your garden, I have reason to be a little more suspicious. Because
And you would probably require something other than eyewitness testimony, especially eyewitness testimony from people you don't know from 2,000 years ago.
not necessarily.
Okay, so if I had eyewitness testimony from people 2,000 years ago that would attest to me having a dragon in my garage, you'd believe it.
It's a little more complicated than that. And that's what
It shouldn't be. Look, I'm making it simple
Jeff,
because it's harder for you to work out of it.
You're being way too simplistic with your what you're acquiring to believe something.
I like it to be simple. I don't like to make it, as you said
difference.
earlier, the simpler option is the better option. I'm just trying to make it a simpler option. You said that eyewitness testimony is what you've presented for an empty tomb. I've given you other eyewitness testimony, which you have disregarded,
but
even though it is better than your eyewitness testimony.
Not at all.
Because it's firsthand.
So, first of all, this is firsthand eyewitness testimony. This is Peter talking to Paul. There's that.
Peter was at the resurrection.
Again,
Cephas, who saw, that's Aramaic for Peter, who saw Jesus.
That's circular.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is.
Most likely it is. No, it's the same reason I take that to be true, because it's trustworthy.
Okay, one second. I want to address something in the chat. So for everybody that's just jumping on, we've been cool, and we're all still cool, but we've been cool, and Jeff and I let him talk for a very long time to put his argument out there so that it was stated. And we still got a point to go through, but you jumped in at the wrong time. And Bram will tell you, we've been very respectful the entire time. So
no, you've been cutting him off the whole damn time.
I was on mute.
If anything, guys, I've been interrupting you more.
The only reason that I interrupt you is because I want to stop where you're at before you get going, and I don't want you to speak for 15 minutes to then have to go backtrack. I'd rather you give us that at the time. So that's the only reason I interrupt. And of course, if you object to that, just let us know and we'll let you go. Okay,
yeah, no, fair enough. I know you're not being rude, and so there's none of that. It's not merely that eyewitness testimony is this good or that good. It depends on the trustworthiness of eyewitness testimony. Let me actually, here's a good quote from Richard Balcom that I pulled up. He's a very good, well-respected historian, and he says it better than I can. He writes, "An irreducible feature of testimony is a form of human utterance, is that it asks to be trusted. This need not mean that it asks to be trusted uncritically, but it does mean that testimony should not be treated as credible only to the extent that it can be independently verified. There can be good reasons for trusting or distrusting a witness, but these are precisely reasons for trusting or distrusting. Trusting testimony is not an irrational act of faith that leaves critical rationality aside. It is, on the contrary, the rationally appropriate way of responding to authentic testimony. Gospels understood as testimony are the entirely appropriate means of access to the historical reality of Jesus." And so Jeff, I see on your TikTok all the time, you get Christians arguing, but what about the 500 witnesses? Now, that doesn't, merely stating the quantity of witnesses, just as you stated the number of witnesses who allegedly saw Bigfoot, does nothing to establish the trustworthiness of that eyewitnesses. And there are other criteria we can look at to see.
Okay, so tell me how you established the credibility of your eyewitnesses.
Because A, it's very early, and B, most likely Paul got it from the very people who are listed as eyewitnesses.
No, Oz. You put your hand down. So if the writings are earlier, they're more credible.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's not a sufficient criteria in some cases.
Okay, so back to my big story. I have firsthand eyewitness accounts. That's better than what you have.
I just don't, Jeff, you haven't given me any details about these firsthand eyewitness accounts. You know, you're exactly right when a Christian comments on your page, but what about the 500 witnesses? And you say, I don't know anything about these 500 witnesses. Mm-hmm. I say the exact same thing to you. I don't know anything about these 1,000 witnesses.
So what do you want? What do you want from me? What do you want from me to establish their credibility?
I'd like.
And you don't know anything about the 500 witnesses.
I'd like to know
Shut up.
how trustworthy they are, and we take it on a
How do you determine how trustworthy they are?
You take it on a case-by-case basis. That's why I need more information than that. That's why.
And how did you establish the trustworthiness of your sources for Jesus' resurrection?
Well, for this 1 Corinthians 15 source, I established it on the basis that it was very early, one, and two, again, that Paul mostly got it from the very people.
So you see the circle we're going in?
This is not a circle at all. The only people who are making it.
Okay, so my sources are credible because they're early. You said that doesn't count. Your sources are credible. How did you? Let me finish.
Oh, sorry.
How did you determine your sources to be credible? You said they're early. So is there another reason that you find your sources to be credible other than the fact that their writings are early? Because I have the same thing with Bigfoot.
I don't know if those are early. I just haven't done research on your.
So if I were to produce firsthand eyewitness accounts of Bigfoot, you would accept them?
Depending on what they saw as well. I mean, it could be Bigfoot from a distance. What if there's also a matter of incentives here? Here's a huge difference. What if they had an incentive to fabricate? I argued that they had the early people who supposedly saw Jesus had absolutely no incentive to fabricate their seeing Jesus, because this is what I brought up in fact number 5. They proclaim Jesus risen despite every predisposition to the contrary, and that's actually what I'm going to get in fact 5. I just need to get there first.
So you're saying that their testimony is more credible because they did not benefit from it?
If you want to put it that way, sure, but I would add as a qualifier that the fact that they not only did not benefit from it, but they also suffered for it, shows that it's not something that they would have freely invented. In other words, they were sincere about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So like people that are in cults that claim to be able to see supernatural events, firsthand accounts, and then died for that account, you would accept that?
So say that one more time.
If I were to give you an example of somebody in a religious cult, maybe 30 people that claim to have seen something supernatural and later died for that event, you would say that what they saw was true?
I wouldn't doubt the sincerity of
But does it add evidence to the fact of the event happening truly?
The fact that they were sincere about it does add evidence to it, but I also have to look just to see if it how well it compares. Again,
so what are the other factors here that are different for your story than other people's stories that you're not accepting? I'm trying to figure out what it is. What's the secret sauce? What's the ingredient that you have here that we don't have for Bigfoot or the Branch Davidians or whatever else I want to go into? Because I have plenty of other examples of people that are willing to die for false things.
Much of this actually is going to be addressed in fact 5. That's why.
But why can't we get to that now? I don't want to get into a script. I kind of want to hear what it is. Like, why don't make us work hard for it? Just give us what is the difference? What is the secret sauce?
Well, Jeff,
what is that special ingredient for the resurrection that makes you accept it and to disagree and be very skeptical of my claim of Bigfoot?
Because it's not just one thing; it's many things, and that's why I was very.
But we've broken it down into those buckets.
This is why I wanted to establish the whole argument first. When we break it down too early like this, then we get tangled in details that don't make sense.
They do. They're very important. We should not gloss over the details.
We get tangled in debates that don't make sense. That don't make sense when we add extra information. So that's why I want to go through defending fact 4 and fact 5 before we start addressing this.
Is 5 the resurrection?
So, 5 is the 5th fact, and then in part 2, I'll argue that the resurrection is the best explanation.
All right, so do this. Get through that in the resurrection. That way we can dig in and we can have some dinner.
So we have that 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8 source. That's a very early and reliable source for these eyewitnesses, because it not only lists the eyewitnesses, Paul probably received it from these eyewitnesses, 2 of whom are listed. So there's that. Moreover, and I don't know if you're going to see this in the Bigfoot cases, that this is multiply and independently attested by other sources. Paul himself claims. Oh, what? Did I miss something?
I literally have thousands of sources of Bigfoot that are independently attested.
I'm skeptical of that, just as you should be skeptical of my claim. So let's talk about that in a second. I'm not saying you shouldn't be skeptical of it.
I've actually been to a conference on cryptozoology with people who are doctorates in cryptozoology that attest to Bigfoot.
All right. Well, we can't outrule Bigfoot existing. There's that. But again, let's talk about fact 4. Let's finish fact 4, and then we'll go to fact 5, and then let's talk about that. That's really not a cop out. I think in light of fact 5, this just doesn't make much sense to talk about. So until then, so we have that 1 Corinthians 15:3-8 creed. We also have the writings of Paul, who claims to be an eyewitness. We have Peter, and this is independently attested in not only John 21, but also Luke 24:34. And the reason we think that Luke 24:34 predates Luke, that he's borrowing from an earlier tradition, is because of his repetition of has and has. And you can, that kind of repetition, that awkward syntax, makes it likely that, that's a funny comment, makes it likely that he's borrowing from an earlier oral tradition.
Can I just concede to you that I believe all of the personal eyewitness testimony that you have is credible in your eyes? Like I don't have a reason to not believe. That's Pennsylvania alone. You go to Oregon, you're going to see a lot more. There have been more sightings in Oregon.
So
the evidence for Bigfoot is overwhelming.
Jeff, we have to take these things on a case-by-case basis. Merely show.
I agree. Bigfoot is a natural explanation. What you have is a supernatural explanation. I need something better than what I have for Bigfoot, and you've not presented.
And I've already,
hold on. Let him get through.
I'm sorry.
Get through this with the resurrection. That way we can chop up. My bad.
Right, sorry. I'm going against my own self. I said we should delay it until then. So, we have James, who's listed as an eyewitness, who is also in Jerusalem, and he was a skeptic, so he didn't have a predisposition to believing that Jesus had risen from the dead. We have the 500 listed. That's not as well attested. The best thing I can say to that is that Paul seems to understand these people as people who are still walking around and living in Jerusalem, and basically saying, go test them yourself. And we have an appearance to all the apostles. And we have an appearance to the women, not mentioned in the creed. I talked about that most likely that was suppressed due to their being women, excuse me. So let's talk about fact 5. We have the origin of the Christian faith, and it's important to remember this argument is confused so much because people think I'm talking about, Christianity spread throughout the world, therefore it's true. Mormonism actually is spreading just as fast as Christianity did in the first century. That doesn't prove anything, of course. But here's the point. Christianity, the belief that Jesus had risen bodily from the dead, did not appear in a vacuum. It came out of a context that was directly opposed to it. No pagan and no Jewish belief can account for this remarkable belief that Jesus had risen from the dead. And here are a few points to make. First of all, we have the Jewish views of the Messiah. If you get a chance, read the pseudepigraphical text, Psalms of Solomon, chapter 17 and 18. And what you'll find is a view of the Messiah that is supposed to, I talked about this a little bit before, a view of the Messiah that is supposed to, cleanse Jerusalem from Gentile sinners, and that's supposed to overtake Roman captivity. That's exactly what we don't see in Jesus. And in fact, like Bar Kokhba during the Second Jewish Revolt, if you're claiming to be the Messiah and you're destroyed by the Roman Empire, that proves that you're a fraudulent Messiah. Now, what makes Jesus different than all these other messianic pretenders who were destroyed by Rome? Their disciples died out. But with Jesus, we see suddenly a movement coming back, saying he was risen from the dead. And that's very hard to explain unless his death stopped at crucifixion. Another dissimilarity we have is Jewish views of the afterlife. Jews understood resurrection as something that was only for the general resurrection at the end of the world. They knew very little of a Messiah, especially Messiah, being resurrected as an individual. We also have the dissimilarity of Jesus's body not shining like a star, which is a smaller point, but in Daniel 12, verse 3, a lot of Jews base their resurrection theology off of this, that the resurrected bodies would be shining like stars. And we don't see the early Jewish Christians presenting Jesus that way. They seem to be describing something that they really saw. And furthermore, this origin of the Christian faith is not something that would be freely shaped, because the eyewitnesses who proclaimed that Jesus was risen from the dead did so despite tons of persecution and so on. And the evidence we have for that is, well, the suffering of the apostles is well documented in many sources. The death of James is documented by Hegesippus, Clement of Alexandria, and Josephus. The martyrdom of Peter is documented by Eusebius, who uses Origen, Tertullian, and Dionysius of Corinth as sources. Clement of Rome and Polycarp in the first century attest to the sufferings of Peter and Paul. The book of Acts recounts many sufferings of the apostles, and Paul's own writings earlier than all these, and especially in 2 Corinthians 11, or 2 Corinthians 11, he describes being shipwrecked, being flogged and beaten, and so on. So it really is not, it is fairly hard to dispute, in my opinion, that the apostles or the eyewitnesses suffered for these beliefs, even some to the point of martyrdom. So those, just to recap, those are my facts. 1, that Jesus was crucified. 2, that he was buried by Joseph of Arimathea. 3, that his tomb was found empty. And 4, that the skeptics and believers alike saw him after his death. And 5, that the Christian faith, namely the belief that Jesus was Messiah and Lord, arose not out of a vacuum, but was preached by people who had absolutely no incentive, and in fact, much incentive to the contrary, to preach what they preached. So there's the facts I would argue for. Now, Jeff, we can start talking about this. We can start talking about different explanations for these.
Well, no, I think that what you gave us, albeit very eloquently, was just eyewitness testimony as evidence.
Okay, so can I ask you a question, Jeff?
Sure, you just did.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question.
Oh, you know what? That was a great question. That was a great.
So, Jeff, do you believe that Alexander the Great? Well, no. Let me use a better example. Do you believe that the Jews were expelled from Rome by Claudius?
I don't know.
Maybe that's too specific. Maybe that's too specific. Do you believe that Plato was a real? Socrates was a real figure?
I don't know.
Really?
I don't know much
even
about
though
Socrates.
Even though we have two independent sources for him,
I have not ever divulged into Socrates' legitimacy.
Okay. What about?
But again, if you could provide an example of a supernatural claim like Jesus' resurrection that I accept based on eyewitness testimony, then I will concede my argument. Well, whether or not Jesus existed is not what's on trial here.
Of course, but that I'm arguing far beyond that.
Well, if you were to ask if Alexander the Great existed, and I said yes.
Well, the point I'm not making is that, do you believe in these historical figures? The point I'm making is that in other areas, I think you trust eyewitness testimony.
Sure, Bigfoot.
So, Jeff, are you telling me that you believe in Bigfoot?
Bigfoot exists. We have thousands of eyewitnesses. They can attest to this.
Please be serious. Are you joking? Do you actually?
No, I'm serious. How could we have thousands of eyewitness testimony from around? Actually, tens of thousands of eyewitness testimony.
Oz, is he messing with me?
No, this is an argument that that we make, whether it's Bigfoot or what's the other one?
Loch Ness Monster? Aliens?
Monster.
Okay,
Yeah.
so you're kidding.
I think there's more evidence for Bigfoot than there is for the Loch Ness Monster.
No,
But
no. What we're saying is we have
fine
more.
then.
We have more firsthand documentation that we can go and we can actually interview people and talk to them about what they saw, heard, experienced, whatever, rather than depending on, like you keep talking about, was it Joseph of Air, or I can never say his name right.
Arimathea.
He was mentioned, I think, once and then never again.
It doesn't matter. What we got here is eyewitness testimony. That's what's on trial. That's the evidence that's presented. That's what we can investigate.
Well, that's what, I didn't even get there yet, but then there's no such thing as eyewitness testimony if we're talking about scripture. There's no such thing.
What are you talking about?
There's no firsthand documentation. Nobody sat down and wrote it as they watched it.
Oh well, no. I would argue that
It's true.
the 1 Corinthians 15 creed is eyewitness testimony. I'd also argue that
Who witnessed it?
Who wrote Corinthians? Who wrote Corinthians?
No, not the Corinthians. The creed sent to the Corinthians list.
Oh, I didn't hear you say creed. I'm sorry.
Oh no problem.
Yeah, but are you saying that we have the original creed that was handwritten at the time when these events were happening?
No, we don't need that. That's why we have textual criticism. We can reconstruct these things. We have 7.
So Jesus, I just want to get this straight.
Okay.
Jesus was God. He died and resurrected on the cross.
I never argued Jesus was God.
I'm saying that. I'm making that claim.
Okay, yeah.
Jesus was God. He died and resurrected on the cross, and the evidence that was left behind, we have to piece together through textual criticism.
That's the same for every other historical event.
So then maybe it's just like every other historical event.
and remarkably, we have more attestation for this than we do for most other events.
So what about the historical event of Bigfoot existing with all these witnesses? Why do you keep denying Bigfoot?
I'm not denying that those people probably saw something.
Okay.
The question is, what was it?
And
that's what
I'm not denying that your people saw something. The question is, what was it?
Exactly. So and just like
So what? Well, answer that. Don't just get around it. So if you don't believe that my eyewitnesses, thousands of them, did not see Bigfoot because it doesn't make sense, then how come you believe that these eyewitnesses saw Jesus and weren't deceived?
So
I have tens of thousands. You have maybe what, 2 stories, two original accounts?
I'll tell you why they weren't deceived in a second. But I do want to say this about Bigfoot. I don't. They probably saw something. I don't know what it was. I have to do more research. For example, how long after the fact did they talk about these things?
So the eyewitnesses aren't good enough on their own.
Jeff, I'm gonna make a few points here.
Okay.
No, it's not that the eyewitnesses aren't good on their own. It's that I need to do more research on the quality of these eyewitnesses. I'm not denying that they probably saw something.
Can I ask what your criteria is for a qualified eyewitness?
It's on a case-by-case basis. It depends entirely on the situation.
Okay, so a situation like supernatural or natural claim, or like what are the situations?
We have no reason to a priori exclude supernatural claims.
Okay, so for a supernatural claim, what would you require to figure out if an eyewitness is valid?
So I would take it on a case-by-case basis, and in this case, because for example, it would severely damage my case if it could be demonstrated that the eyewitnesses had a big incentive to borrow from earlier things, and that they could have easily fabricated this. That would be the same amount of quote-unquote eyewitness testimony, but it wouldn't be as good as quality. That's why I don't really care about your 1,000 witnesses, because I need to investigate the quality of this eyewitness testimony.
And Bram, that's exactly what we're saying, is we don't care about your witness because we can't verify that they were quality. Were you alive 2,000 years ago? Do you know
that's not the criteria we need to use for verification?
But you're not telling me what your criteria is. You keep saying it's case by case.
We don't know what you're saying.
You need to have a objective criteria for determining whether or not a supernatural event happened. It's not case by case, because that means that you're bending your standards of evidence to fit the narrative of the story, not the conditions in which the story happened. If it is a supernatural claim, so if it's a supernatural claim, like Jesus existed and rose from the dead, and Bigfoot existed, these are both supernatural claims. You should have the same standard of evidence.
Existing is not a supernatural claim.
Okay, so then we should have less evidence, and I have more evidence for
And
that.
I've already talked about why extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Is
So-
demonstrably false.
So
Why do
what would
keep
you
on saying it?
require? What would you require of me to prove to you that I have a spaceship that can fly at the speed of light?
You would probably. Well, I would prefer that you would show me the spaceship, but there are other ways you can do it too. If I get multiple people, if it's reported on the news, for example, that you have a spaceship. If some people whom I trust
Okay.
say, "Hey,
So
look,
who
I
do
saw,
you?
I saw Jeff has a spaceship. I saw it myself. Now I'm going to hand this on to you."
You would believe, based on just solely people telling you that I have a spaceship that goes at the speed of light, which is not technologically available right now. You'd believe it based on that?
Well, no, because the fact that you're going at the speed of light reduces
It's impossible.
reduces the
It's known to be impossible.
reduces the background probability to zero.
Yes. People raising from the dead, zero.
Naturally, that's impossible, but I would say that supernaturally, that's
So
possible.
you're pleading a special case here for Jesus.
Not at all. I'm just saying the historic.
All right.
Let me. This might
Bram-
help. I have a
Bram-
4-step argument.
Well, hold on. We don't need to break out another 4 steps. Let's do this and then get into the resurrection. That way we can get into the meat of that. But I do have one question just to kind of end that part of it, and then we can get into your last the last part of your method there. So, do you trust your dad?
I do.
Do you think that your dad more times than not is going to be a reliable source or resource or even a witness to a situation?
Yes.
Okay. Has your dad ever been wrong about anything?
Mhm.
Okay, that's what we're trying to say. You
Okay.
can say that you know your dad. You can verify that. We don't know him.
But Oz, I'm not saying it's
but-
necessarily true. I'm saying that I'm warranted in my belief that it's probably true. I mean,
Okay, well, that's the thing I want to throw out there. That's why I brought that up, because what you've said a lot tonight is well, here I wrote it down. Likely, probably, maybe.
Yeah, because in history we don't deal with absolute certainty. We deal with degrees of probability. That's
Okay,
how history.
okay. So then I was just maybe I was thrown off then because you seem to assert it as if though it's an absolute.
So okay, that's a good point. People I've talked to tell me that I seem to assert it like that. I don't mean to assert it like that. If I do, my apologies. I can come off fairly strong. No, I don't argue that it is absolutely certain, based on historical method, that Jesus rose from the dead. I said it's the most probable explanation. We're arguing in terms of probability. So my apologies if I misconstrued it that way.
Okay, no worries. And yeah, if that's not what it is, that's cool. But that's when I hear maybes and likelies and all that,
Yeah.
but it comes off as if we're asserting it to be a truth or an absolute truth. I got to push back. But so
I would
if you need
push back that too. Yeah.
if you need to finish there, or if you want to go into the last step, that's cool too. That way we can because I want to be able to have a healthy conversation there, because that's the one that really matters to me, and I think Jeff too. And then that way we can do some Q&A, because there's been some great questions in the comment section that I don't want to lose. So
Yeah. But can I just, Jeff, on your point about eyewitness testimony, there again are a few. I think I know now better what you're asking for. So here are a few criteria I'd use to say that this eyewitness testimony is better than that eyewitness testimony. One is that the eyewitness testimony was recalled at an earlier rather than later time, because people tend to forget things. That's one thing.
Bram, sorry to interrupt. They're saying in the chat that your volume's a little low, so if you can turn up or maybe get a little closer.
My apologies. So one thing I would say is that one criteria I would use to measure eyewitness testimony is to say whether it was recalled at a later time or at an earlier time. That's an important part, because people forget things. Another thing that we see, and this is important to the transmission of the stories about Jesus, is whether there was a deliberate intention to preserve as faithfully as possible these stories. I don't know if that's true about Bigfoot. Did Bigfoot have a center of authority
We don't have to because we have the original accounts, so they've been preserved in their entirety.
in their
100%.
in their memories?
100%. No, they've been written down. We have the original firsthand accounts of people that saw Bigfoot.
So can you show me what these are?
Yeah, I can give you some first eyewitness accounts if you want. I could give you thousands.
Okay, so
there's an entire website that I can provide you where you have firsthand eyewitness accounts from people that you can talk to. So is it early? Yes. Is it a deliberate attempt to preserve? Absolutely. We have the originals. So what are the other factors?
I think the uselessness of bringing this up is that I have no way of. I haven't done.
I think the issue is
if you're been able to do research on this Bigfoot thing.
If you're honest with yourself and us right now, then you realize that the evidence that you have for the resurrection of Jesus Christ does not fit the minimum facts you need to believe in a supernatural event. And the only reason that you're accepting the Jesus story is based on your feelings and your desire for the story, nothing else.
Jeff, that's where you start getting into invalid and unevidenced conjectures. Frankly, you don't even know anything about my feelings. So talk about a leap of faith. There's the first thing. No, I'm comparing it to the standards of ancient history. Socrates has two sources, Xenophon and Plato.
Socrates didn't raise from the dead.
Okay, and I've already addressed the problem of assigning a prior probability to a miracle claim. And I've already talked about that. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
I know what you got the pieces moving. You got them going, but you're not putting it together. If it's a similar claim, give me a similar claim that's a supernatural claim that we take based on early deliberate evidence. You gave me your factors. You said early.
This makes no.
You said a deliberate attempt to preserve. What else?
Exactly where is the parallel? I really don't understand. Okay.
The parallel is we have two claims. We have a claim that Bigfoot exists, and we have a claim that Jesus rose from the dead. And I'm trying to figure out what in your mind makes it go, that's real.
Except
what you've given me.
Here's the problem, Jeff. I never denied Bigfoot. What I said is I don't know because I haven't looked further into what these people are saying.
And I'm trying to figure out what it is about what they need to say, what the factors are, what those things are. And what you've given me is it early?
The question,
and is it a deliberate attempt to preserve the writings?
The question is, I don't know. And I promise you that if I find a good parallel between the evidence for Bigfoot and the evidence for Jesus, I'll believe in Bigfoot too. Except I just
what is that? So what is that factor?
Well,
is it the stories?
This is where your oversimplification comes in.
No, but it's perfect.
When you're dealing with parallels like this, there are a ton of factors playing. The context of oral transmission in first century Palestinian Judaism does not resemble at all memory transmission in modern America. I have to look at it on a case by case basis. So I'm not.
So then you don't have a objective view of determining if a claim is true or not. You look at it individually.
That's not what I said at all. I said.
Okay, so then what is the objective list of ways that you validate eyewitness testimony?
There are a few criteria that we can use to say that this is better than the other. It doesn't follow from that if I just check off this box and this box for this and check off this box and this box for that when it comes to criteria, that there's a parallel there. I have to look.
Okay, so let's say I have equal attestments. I have equal firsthand accounts for Bigfoot and Jesus. What makes the Jesus claim true or more probable?
It doesn't. If those
so then they're equal.
If those were really equal, then they'd be equally.
Sure. So what is it about the eyewitness testimony that you don't trust from Bigfoot?
It's not that I don't trust it. I just don't know it.
So if I provide you eyewitness testimony,
Jeff,
but this is the question I've given you and you haven't answered it.
Okay.
If I provide you eyewitness testimony to read from people that attest to Bigfoot, does that then prove Bigfoot is probable?
that wouldn't be sufficient. I'd have to look at the quality and trustworthiness of that.
And how do you determine the quality and trustworthiness of that?
On a case-by-case basis. And there's certain criteria
like what?
to use. Again, the earliness of it.
Okay, so earliness.
What exactly they saw.
Okay, what they saw.
Did they have an incentive to fabricate it?
Incentive to fabricate.
A lot of these things, and they're multiple that stack up. I'm not sure I can give you a complete list right now because there's many.
I think you should determine. I think you should after this think about that. Think about how. Well, let me think. Stop talking and listen to this part, and I'm gonna stop talking. I'm gonna let you go.
All right.
Stop the wheels from moving and take a step back and think. How do I, Bram, determine in my life what is true and what is false? And if I can't have a holistic way to do that, then you need to step away from that and say, well, I don't know if Jesus resurrected from the dead versus saying, I know that Jesus resurrected from the dead. That's the difference with the two claims.
So, Jeff, me being unwilling to produce an exact exhaustive list of all the criteria necessary to measure eyewitness testimony against or different eyewitness testimonies against each other does not mean that I don't have such a system of weighing that evidence. That's what I mean by looking at case-by-case basis.
Yes, but if I provide you evidence, I don't understand what you mean. Like, I can give you.
But Jeff, if you provide me parallel evidence, I can promise you I will believe in Bigfoot. I mean, is that good enough for you? The problem is I just haven't looked at these 1,000 accounts, and I'd like to look at them. And if they are truly parallel, then I'll believe it.
Okay.
If it comes to the point where
I'm going to put a link. There's a link to a publication with actual firsthand accounts of Bigfoot.
Okay. So if in the end, positing that Bigfoot was actually seen rather than Bigfoot was not seen, or that these people merely saw things that weren't Bigfoot.
How do you determine they did not see Bigfoot?
Well, I'll look at the evidence, Jeff.
Okay, so what is the evidence that you require to know that someone saw Bigfoot?
I would take that on a case-by-case basis. We have to break it, just as you would break down my argument individually. I mean, this is
okay.
The problem.
So let's hold on, guys.
We got
hold on.
Q&A, I think.
Just a minute. Hold on, guys. Stop. We're at 2 hours and 15 minutes, and we got one more thing to do, and I want to do Q&A. So we need to move on. So, Bram, I believe the resurrection was the last point. So go ahead and go through your point on that, and then we'll get into that because that's what I've been waiting for.
All right. So I think we have a few rival explanations at our hand. One would be a stolen body. The problem I have with that is it lacks explanatory scope. It doesn't explain the appearances. It also lacks explanatory power. We have three options when it comes to who could steal the body. First, we have Christians. Christians would not steal the body, proclaim Jesus as the risen Messiah, and then suffer for that belief, knowing it was false. The enemies of Jesus, they knew the tomb. Joseph of Arimathea knew the tomb. They could have the preaching flourished in Jerusalem. They could have easily checked the tomb, and really what we find is they did and said that the disciples stole the body. The third option we have are grave robbers. The problem with grave robbers is that in ancient history, the grave robbers were looking for valuables. They would certainly find no valuables in Jesus's tomb because he was a Roman crucifixion victim buried by a Jew trying to get Deuteronomy 21 done for the night. So if they went into the tomb and found they wouldn't just carry the body away, for goodness sake. And if they could, then they would have much of an incentive to give it to the Romans to shut down, or the Jews to shut down this movement. Hallucinations. That's another theory we can talk about. By itself, it also lacks explanatory scope. It doesn't explain the empty tomb. And when you put the hallucination theory and the empty tomb together, it makes it very ad hoc. And if you want more information on that, just check out Gerd Ludemann's book, who tries to approach it that way. first of all, as the psychologist Gary Collins writes, hallucinations are individual occurrences. By their very nature, only one person can see a given hallucination at a time. They're certainly not something that can be seen by a group of people. Since a hallucination exists only in the subjective personal sense, it is obvious that others cannot witness it. Collective hallucinations simply don't occur. Now, there's one study, I think made in the 70s by Leonard Susney and Warren Jones, that claimed that collective hallucinations do occur, but they note that, quote, expectation and, quote, emotional excitement are, quote, a prerequisite for collective hallucinations. However, the disciples would not have been expectant or excited after Messiah was proven a fraud and their leader had died. It is also unlikely that Paul and James, two skeptics, would hallucinate the risen Jesus as a result of grief. So I think the hallucination theory is beyond implausible. And it's much more complicated than just saying that Jesus rose from the dead. As historians, we can remain agnostic as to what the actual cause of that was, but nonetheless, he was alive. He was dead, and then he was alive.
Are you saying that historians agree that Jesus rose from the dead?
Well, not all of them. I'm saying, as a historian, using the historical method, we're within our rights to say that Jesus was once dead and that he was alive again. And as historians, we can remain agnostic as to what the cause of that was.
Not trying to make an ad populist.
No, I'm not. This is not an appeal to authority.
Sure. So, but do you think though that the majority of historians agree with you?
The majority of historians studying this field, according to Gary Habermas's survey, 75% of New Testament scholars agree. But the problem with that statistic,
we're talking about historians. There are a lot of historians that study Middle East.
Yeah. Hey guys, real quick. One of our friends wanted to come on and chop it up with us. Give me 1 second.
Hi.
Shannon, how are you?
Good. Sorry, I heard something while you were. Hi, Bram. Nice to meet you. I'm Shannon.
Hey, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. I heard you say something, and I just wanted to kind of address it because the psychologist in me kind of had like a little bit of a spaz.
Uh-oh.
So especially the cognitive neuroscientist in me. So you said that verbal traditions previously were somehow better than now. So somehow people had. Okay, so did you appeal at some point, just so that I can make sure I'm understanding, that verbal traditions were somehow better previously than they are now?
Well, we don't really have. No, I don't say that. I do say that there was, in the early church, there was a deliberate intent to preserve the traditions of Jesus as faithfully as possible, and they did that through oral tradition. Now, that's not at all.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. This is an important point to hammer home, though, and I think that it kind of gets glossed over a lot. You understand that from a neuropsychological perspective, that we are not any less capable now of rote memory. Do you know what rote memory is?
No, I don't.
Rote memory is the type of memory that's utilized when you're memorizing like streams of information. So streams of data or streams of words, or like any type of like what people would probably affiliate with like a photographic or eidetic information. So our cognitive capacity to retain that information is no better now than it was previously, and it's not particularly good. So I just want to hammer this point home because I hear it so often that there was a point in time when, because it was important for people to recall information, that somehow made our capacity cognitively to remember that information and articulate and transmit it effectively and accurately was somehow better as a result. And that is just patently false.
And I agree. So, and I don't think anything I said, if I suggested that, I didn't mean to. I wouldn't argue that in the least bit. In fact, I'm working on a book right now Jesus and the
Okay.
Eyewitnesses by Richard Balcom. And he
Okay.
cites a bunch of memory studies, and he addresses this point. He says explicitly that this is simply not the case. So I agree with you
Oh,
completely. I
good.
wasn't arguing in the least bit that our memory has somehow gotten worse. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
but
Okay,
but
perfect. I
but
just go ahead. Sorry.
it is important to point out that um, in societies that transmitted information mostly orally, they had
Mm-hmm.
cultural systems designed better than ours today, which are not mostly transmitted orally,
Mm-hmm.
or our traditions and our history.
Mm-hmm.
These systems and oral cultures were better suited to pass on information
What
orally.
do you mean by better suited? When you say better suited, do you mean that they are better suited in the way that they're trained so that they understand its importance and focus on it as they realize it's important? Or do you mean that they are able to transmit it accurately? Because that's an incredibly important distinction.
I mean the former.
Okay, so if you're going to lean
There's a
upon it as a like one moment, please, because if you are going to lean upon it
sorry about
as though it's an ability to transmit information accurately, you would admit, I'm certain that that's a mistake, correct?
that. Absolutely. And
Okay,
I'm
that's
sorry if
important to
I
me.
accidentally interrupted you. The my voice is louder than the volume on my iPad. It only gets so loud. So
It's okay.
sometimes when I'm talking, I don't know that you're talking because my voice goes over it. So sorry about that.
That's absolutely fine. That's totally fine. So I have one more question. I feel like I'm monopolizing because I find this interesting. So
No problem.
you mentioned eyewitness testimony. You're aware that the only attested historical eyewitness to the resurrection of Jesus that we have any record of is Paul, though, right? On the road to Damascus, and that other people who were around him, admittedly by him in his attestation, said that they did not witness what he witnessed, even though they were present, and he was the only one who witnessed it.
So no, I don't agree with that. First of all, Paul doesn't write that. Luke writes that in his account in Acts 9:22 and 26. So that's a
Yeah,
Luke's
but
account.
Luke's anonymous.
I don't believe that was anonymous. We can. That's
Well, all the biblical scholars do, though. All the New
no,
Testament
not at
scholars.
all. I mean, no, certainly
Yeah,
not.
no, they do. Who's like
No.
who? Can you name a biblical scholar that doesn't believe that it's anonymous? Like none of the Gospels have
Richard
signed
Balcom.
authors.
Richard
He
Balcom.
believes that
Mar,
Luke,
Mar,
like, and you're talking about Luke the physician, I presume, Luke that traveled with Paul. So
yeah.
if Luke that traveled with Paul wrote the Gospels, he couldn't have been an eyewitness because he wasn't one of the disciples. So when he wrote the Gospels as though he was an eyewitness to the resurrection, he couldn't have been. So most people who
There are a
are
few.
in biblical literature wouldn't think that he was an actual eyewitness if it was Luke the physician that wrote it. He would have been recounting somebody else's eyewitness testimony at best, right?
Sorry. Well, there are a few points of confusion. Well, I take
I'm
that.
not confused.
I think there are few points of misinformation here. I take what you mean by the account is anonymous. I mean the Acts is anonymous, meaning that Luke
You're
really did.
talking about the Gospel of Luke, though. You said that in the Gospel of Luke. I'm talking about the Gospel of Luke.
I'm talking about Acts, and Luke wrote
Okay.
both Acts and Luke. Same
So the
person.
initial reference you made to the Gospel of Luke, was that not prescient to the conversation that we're currently having with
No,
regard to
I didn't.
eyewitness
I didn't.
testimony?
No, ma'am. I didn't make a reference to the Gospel of Luke. I made a reference to Acts 9, Acts 22, and Acts 26, and I said that was written by Luke. And there are
Okay.
many scholars who take that view. Martin Hengel, for example, Richard Balcom.
So where in Acts did it say that there was an eyewitness? Because that was the referential point of our conversation, that Paul was the only eyewitness. And as a counter to that, you said in Luke, and Luke being an eyewitness, but Luke, the physician who traveled with Paul, wasn't actually an eyewitness, but you're saying he's the person who authored Luke, but now you're saying he's the person who authored Acts, but Acts isn't an eyewitness testimony of the resurrection, which is the point of contention. So let's get back to the point of contention. So how many eyewitnesses are there other than Paul, knowing that the Gospels are anonymous and Paul is the only known author of any of the New Testament books?
So I disagree with about 3 points you made. First of all, no, I was not saying that Luke was an eyewitness. I was responding to your point that Paul was the one that said that other people around him didn't hear the voice or didn't see the light. And
Certainly he did, yeah.
So no, Paul didn't write that. Luke wrote that. In Paul's own account, we don't see that. So that was the point I was bringing up. Secondly, the importance of bringing in the early creed, which I argue is formed within months of after the cross, is good evidence, and it lists the eyewitnesses directly. It's clearly an eyewitness summary, and furthermore, I think Paul got this from two of the eyewitnesses listed, namely Peter and James. So, and the
why would you think that?
Well, for the reasons I already said, that it's very early, and from Paul's own accounts, he said he was in Jerusalem, and knowing what we know about the chronology of Paul's life after the cross, that's the best.
But he said that Peter added nothing to his gospel, or added nothing to his testimony.
Where does he? Not in the creed.
Oh, which creed are you talking about?
Oh, the one in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8.
Okay, are you talking about his meeting with Peter? Perhaps that's where I'm getting confused. Because in his meeting with Peter, he said that he added nothing to his testimony. Did he not?
I'm having trouble understanding what you're saying. I think Paul passed on to, I think Peter and James passed on to Peter this official charismatic.
But there's no record of an interaction with James, so why would you think that? He just referenced that he. Not an interaction with James. Where does Paul say James said?
Galatians 1:18 and 19.
What does he say James said there? That's interesting because I'll go look it up. Absolutely.
He says
like to be knowledgeable.
He said that he was with Peter and James in Jerusalem. And what I'm arguing,
I agree with that.
Yeah, and what I'm arguing is that when we piece together other pieces of evidence,
but when I asked the question, where does Paul said and James said, and I'm assuming you're presuming that this is the attestation of James, the brother of Jesus. So where does Paul say? Where does he recount James said X?
I don't think I said that Paul said James said X. I said
okay, but you're appealing to what you think Paul might have thought James thought.
I'm appealing to, I think the best. The way we can account for how Paul got this early creed is by saying that he got it from Peter and or James in Jerusalem.
So that's just an inference in order, though, right? Like you recognize that that's just an inference.
It's an educated inference.
It's also an educated inference to say that he got it from the people around him. He'd been persecuting Christians for quite some time, so it would be logical to assume that he had heard the creed at some point since he'd been around Christians and was persecuting them for Christianity. So it would be a great likelihood that he was familiar with their beliefs, and then after his conversion was familiar with beliefs as a result of surrounding himself with Christians and presenting himself as the one prophet of Jesus. That's equally a logical inference. So
I don't believe that.
My inference you don't believe it, but you're presenting this as fact. If you're going to present it, so you're presenting this as something you believe, and these are your reasons for believing it, not the reasons anyone else should.
Well, no. I'm just saying. I think I can demonstrate. I think that we have good reason to think that your inference is not as good. So, if Peter got it from these other people and he just kind of picked it up, then he would be using his own language. This.
Why? How do you know he would use it? How do you know what his language was?
Well, because if he's just getting it from other Christians hearing it, he's not going to get it as an official, formulated oral tradition charismatic summary. This is something the repetition.
Can you explain that to me?
Yeah, sure.
He's not going to get it as a charismatic. What do you mean by charismatic summary?
Sorry,
and then I'll frig off. I'm sorry. I was mostly just here for the psychology part, but I'm interested.
Oh, no, history. It's fine. I love talking to you. The charismatic, the charisma has to do with the official apostolic proclamation of who Jesus was in the early church. So when I talk about a charismatic summary, I'm talking about a summary of the traditions of Jesus's life, death, and resurrection. So what I'm saying is that the structure and the non-Pauline language of this creed in
This
First
creed in
Corinthians
Acts
in First
or
Corinthians, yeah,
Okay.
1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, bears the
Mhm.
marks of a creed passed on to Paul. First of all, because he explicitly says
Does Paul attribute it to James? So you're saying
Paul attributes it to something he was handed on. Elsewhere in Paul, we
What does
know.
it have to do with James then?
Well, I'll tell you why. I'll connect the dots for you here.
Okay.
He said, "This is I handed on to you what I in turn received." We know from other places like Galatians 2, 1 through 10, that Paul thought of Jerusalem as the center of the authority on what the kerygma was supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
We know that he was in Jerusalem with Peter and James about 5 years after his after the cross. Excuse me. And so we can connect the dots and say that most likely he got this creed while he was with Peter and or James in
Mm-hmm.
Jerusalem, because it bears the marks of this charismatic summary, which also appears elsewhere. For example, in the Passion story, in the pre-Mark and Passion story, mind you, in Mark, and also the charismatic summary in Acts 13. So this seems like something that clearly resembles an official apostolic proclamation, and we know that Jerusalem was the head of that.
Oh, okay, cool. Okay, I understand what you're saying then. So
Yeah.
I'm going to leave momentarily because I know Jeff has to go, and I completely interrupted this, which is very inappropriate of me. So I apologize. Jeff, I love you. I love you, Jeff. You're great.
I love you too, but I still feel the need to see other people.
That's fair. But no, but I just want to, yeah, no, I appreciate it. Like, I just want to summarize. So the reason that you feel as though that creed came from James is because Paul was in Jerusalem and saw Jerusalem as important, and we know that he met with James while he was there. Therefore, you feel as though it's a likely inference, even though there's no particular evidence that it came from James, that you would infer that it does.
I don't like your last statement that there's no particular evidence. Not only James, but also Peter. I think when you look at, I don't really have time to get in this in detail, but when you look at,
oh my gosh, neither of us do. I am going to leave because I feel like I'm an interloper at the moment, and I'm so sorry. Okay. Jeff, I love you. Hi, you're really pretty tonight. You look really pretty. I'm sorry. I'm a nightmare. People shouldn't invite me places. Also, it was really nice to meet you, Bram. I'm Shannon. I'm so sorry that we met this way. Hopefully we can interact again. It was nice to meet you. Have a good night. See you later.
Thank you for holding me accountable on psychology. So.
Got ya. Anytime, all day, every day. Anytime. See you later.
Well. We meet again.
Yeah.
So, no, I was just gonna say I'm gonna take off, and I know Oz is coming back here in a moment. Okay. But I wanted to tell you that I do appreciate you coming and spending the time and defending your position, and having the courage to come on here and let people beat up on you somewhat, on your position and refine it and whatnot. So I really do admire your courage for that, to come on and defend your position. I appreciate that, and I love the discussion. I hope you do too.
I thought it was really fun. I still don't accept your Bigfoot parallel, not because
go to the book. The second book I gave you is True Stories. These are actual Bigfoot eyewitnesses. You can investigate them for yourselves and then get back to me and think. I just want you to think.
Yeah, of course.
What are the standards that I have for evidence in my life? That's for you. That's an inside dialogue to have.
Fair enough, Jeff. But all I wanted to say is that this might have been what you're thinking. If this is what it is, I want to say that this is not correct. I'm not a priori rejecting this evidence for Bigfoot. I'm saying that I just need to research it more and see if it actually compares. That's not me saying, I think you got the impression that I was saying, well, no, I reject this evidence. I don't. I just need to investigate it further. I was kind of put on the spot. I didn't have time to do it now.
I'll let you look into it, and I would love to know what your your dissection of the of the firsthand eyewitness accounts, and let me know what you think.
But I will say this: I think that the parallels that I have looked at, or the alleged parallels, just don't stand up. So that's what I would say. Anyway, all right. Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, not a problem.
Are we doing a? Oh. Hey, Oz. Oh, I think you're. Am I muted?
Well. No, I wasn't. You- if you watch enough of our episodes, there's the hashtag mute Oz for that very reason.
Oh, are we doing a Q&A now?
Yeah, we're getting ready to do the Q&A. I did, because the resurrection part, I don't want to spend a bunch more time there, but I do have a couple questions that I want to ask. So
Right.
so I listened to the whole thing, and I did part of the purpose of me backing up. I never want anybody to feel like they're getting like teamed up on or ganged up on. So that's kind of the reason I backed out. So for you and for the viewers, so just so everybody's clear, I don't want that. We never want anybody to feel like that. So. But now that we've got to the end of it and we've went through the argument for the crucifixion, and through to the resurrection, is that what convinces you that there is a God, and is that what appeals to you and causes you to believe in a God? What you just presented tonight?
I think that the connection between Christianity being true in a general sense and Jesus rising from the dead, I think the way you connect those two is by looking at the religio historical context. And if you remember, I started out by my argument with that, and I said that, and I defended the historicity of Jesus's predictions about his passion, namely his death and his resurrection. So I think that context combined with an empty tomb and appearances of Jesus together make a compelling case for us thinking that Jesus was who he claimed to be.
Okay, and do you believe that Jesus is God?
Yes.
Okay.
But not through that alone. I believe I would have a separate argument to biblical authority, and I believe the Bible says that Jesus is God. So from that, I believe that Jesus is God, but not from this argument. No.
Yeah, and I should have prefaced now, kind of backing off of your presentation. And by the way, I'll pause here. I will say, even though I don't agree, you did great tonight, man. You kicked ass. You did very, very well, and kudos to you. And there's a couple people in the chat even said it, and I will hold the same position that if we lived close to each other, I would offer to buy you lunch and pick your brain and get to it, and I mean that. And you're you're respectful and all that. I think that's awesome. If we do take a step back from just the presentation tonight, and to take a more broad view on your belief, are you convinced by the argument you presented tonight, or is there something else that convinces you?
Do you mean, am I convinced that I should be a Christian, or am I convinced just that Jesus rose from the dead?
Just being a Christian, that the Christian God is real and exists and is present in your life.
Yes, I would say, yeah, in large part, yeah.
Is the information you presented tonight?
I think that if I didn't have any other argument for the Christian faith, which I believe I do, that's a separate thing. But if I didn't have any other argument for the Christian faith and I only had this one, I would still be a Christian because of this argument. Yeah.
Okay. And for the information you presented tonight, do you is it directly related to or correlated to faith, or do you believe that you have knowledge?
So I think that I hear atheists misdefine the word faith, pistis, all the time. I want to clarify for this for everybody to understand. The biblical definition of faith is not taking a blind leap and just saying you believe something without evidence. That's why we distinguish in Christian theology between a faith that and a faith in. For example, my mom and dad are married. That's why they're my mom and dad. My parents are married. my dad does not have faith that he has a wife. He has evidence. He lives with his wife. He sees my mom every day, but he has a trust in his wife. That's what faith is. When Paul says we're justified by faith and not works, he doesn't say we're justified by intellectual agreement without evidence and not works. He means that we're justified by our trust in God and not our own deeds. Do you understand the distinction? So I don't think you said, is that knowledge or is that faith? I think it's knowledge in it, and based on this knowledge, I have good reason to put my faith in God.
Well, but would it be fair to say that your knowledge is rooted in the faith?
In other words, are you asking if I believe these things because I'm already a Christian?
No. What I'm saying is because of your faith in God and in that belief, and because that faith is so strong, then you then credit that as knowledge, because faith gives you that that grounding. The faith gives you grounding to count it as being knowledge.
No, I'd say my faith is based on my knowledge. What I know, what I've studied, and what the arguments that I believe are true give me an epistemic grounding for putting my trust or faith in Christ.
Okay, no,
In other
I
words,
appreciate.
if I didn't have any arguments from the Christian faith, I wouldn't be a Christian, and I know that's true. I know I'm not just saying that because I have gone through that period where I rejected Christianity intellectually because I didn't see any evidence for it. So I'm convinced, in other words, I'm convinced that I am putting my faith in Christ for a good reason. Now, we shouldn't be too quick to discredit in philosophy what's called Reformed epistemology, pioneered by people like Alvin Plantinga and everything, which talks about properly basic beliefs. I don't want to get to that right now, and I couldn't argue. I'm not a philosopher. I couldn't argue for that. But I think there is a plausible philosophical case to be made for people having epistemic warrant for putting their faith in Christ, even when they have no outside evidence. In other words, for knowing that Christianity is true without being able to demonstrate it.
Okay, so if we pause there and then I ask you, then based on what you just shared, could we agree that in our day-to-day lives that faith, even your definition of it, which I'll follow up on that here in a minute, that faith can lead us to both true and untrue things?
Yes, but the reason I know where you're getting at. I think I know the street epistemology guys. What I'm getting at is that someone can have. There's a difference between, or let me say this: someone can have a warrant, an epistemic warrant for believing something, without that thing being true. I can have very good reason to believe that let's say in the end we find out somehow in the future that the past is an illusion. Maybe you think the past is an illusion, but let's just say, or better yet, that I'm a brain in a vat, in a chemical vat, and I'm just being. It's like the Matrix. I'm not really me. It's just my brain being pumped up with electricity and crap. So those weren't very technical terms, but while it might remain true that I'm just a brain in a vat, that doesn't mean that in this life I can't have an epistemic warrant or epistemic justification for believing that I'm not just a brain in a vat, that I'm actually a real person living a real life. So there's
Yeah, there is a difference, because just because you've convinced yourself of something doesn't mean that that's true. So how did you
Of course
how
not.
did
That's
yeah so
precisely what I'm arguing. I'm saying that there's a difference between um, whether that belief is true or not true objectively, and whether someone can have an epistemic warrant for holding that belief, given
okay
what they know.
so would that be would that be a fancy way of saying, based on my experience and what I've read and what I've watched and what I've seen, I've put my faith in or believe that have knowledge of X?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's precisely what a properly basic belief is. An example would be, we can't demonstrate that the past isn't a construct from 5 minutes ago, but we are warranted in believing that the past isn't a construct from 5 minutes ago purely because of our experience. So I think belief in the reality of the past is a properly basic belief. And here's an important thing to qualify that: properly basic beliefs stand in the absence of a defeater. If something new comes along and proves that my experience is false, then I no longer have an epistemic warrant for my belief based on my experience. So
Okay. So then what is it then through that path? Why does that convince you then? Because we're not talking about evidence. We're not talking about anything that you can test. Like there's nothing here that we can test and demonstrate it to actually be true objectively. So why should any of us be convinced that it's true if it's something that we can't run through a sequence of testing or measuring?
because that's scientism slash logical positivism or some form of that. And basically, uh, simply put, if you claim that the only things that you can know are the ones that are testable, that's a self-refuting statement. Why? Because the very claim that you can only know things that are testable itself is a claim that can't be tested. It's a self-refuting position. In fact, there are many things we know that we can believe that we can't test. For example, properly basic beliefs like belief that the past isn't a construct of 5 minutes ago. Beliefs in history we can't test. We can't go back to those people and talk to them. Um, let's say 400 years from now, people might people won't be able to look at the Holocaust and actually talk to the victims face to face and rerun the experiment again to see if it happens the same way again, like we do in science. But they'd still be warranted in believing that the Holocaust actually occurred. Testability simply is not a necessary condition for knowing things.
But you do understand that going taking taking faith, even if you want to define it as pistis and the way you define it, taking that and combining that with a belief doesn't mean we came to a true thing or a real thing.
That's exactly what I'm not arguing. That's why I'm making a sharp distinction between epistemic warrant and something being objectively true.
And Bram, hey Bram, great job today.
Thank you.
Of all the things that you've put together to establish your belief and your justified reason to believe that Christianity is true, what could crack that and lead you to have a disbelief? What would be one thing if you could go down that path for us?
If it could be proven that, or if it, again, I'm gonna. Sorry, I need to be held up to my own standards here because I already said that we can't prove things in history. If it could be demonstrated to where it's most probable that Jesus did not, in fact, rise from the dead or exist or anything like that, I would not be a Christian any longer because my faith would be in vain.
So the resurrection would it be the resurrection then? Just that?
Yes, it definitely would.
So how would that look? How could we actually prove a resurrection didn't occur?
Good question. If it could be shown, for example, that the resurrection story was simply most likely a ripoff of earlier pagan myths or something like that, and that there's most likely no historical resurrection, then I would say that's good enough for me.
And how did you establish with such confidence that one did occur?
By looking at the evidence. I read both what Christians had to say and what atheists had to say, and I came to my conclusions.
And if you look at the scientific data on the scientific method that it's near impossible that resurrections can occur, what made you kind of shun your view at that evidence?
I would say because the explanatory hypothesis. Well, I'm not shunning that evidence. I agree completely. My explanatory hypothesis that I'm defending is not that Jesus rose naturally from the dead. It's that Jesus rose supernaturally from the dead, and it's a miracle. And I gave certain criteria for distinguishing between miracles and anomalies. I talked about the philosophy of miracles in history a bit. We can go more into that, but those are two different statements.
Could you be wrong?
Of course.
And what do you think your life would look like if you were wrong?
I'd probably I'd probably I'd probably go into well, I can promise you I'd stop all my interest. I'd have no more interest in reading the Bible or doing New Testament studies or apologetics, and I'd probably just live a YOLO lifestyle. You only live once. Make it here and now, that kind of thing.
Interesting. Now, with Oz being a Christian for so long,
Yeah.
What do you think swayed his opinion on his belief? Because he was heavily into Christianity for such a long time.
I had a short, interesting talk with Oz. It wasn't long enough. I'd like to know more about his story, but it seems like Oz grew up in a toxic Christian environment. He had I guess, would you call it religious trauma? I mean, I don't.
Yep.
Yeah, sometimes that word trauma is thrown around too lightly, and it's a very serious thing. But it sounds like he had religious trauma, and finally said that this is. I mean, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, Oz. This is just what I think I heard from you. He just looked at that and said, "This is. I don't want to live this way anymore," and probably no one was there to give him good reasons uh, to be a Christian, and so he was well within his rights to leave that toxic Christian environment.
No, that's. I think you summed it up pretty well. I think, Oz, that's fair comments. The reason to believe something, should it be based on whether you're in a toxic environment or not?
No, but I think if that in combination with not knowing any good reasons for remaining a Christian, I think that's a good reason to leave that environment as fast as possible.
Okay. Yeah. And I have one last question, and I appreciate you being candid. So I'm not a believer in deities, and I've never been Christian. Other than the Bible and reading any old ancient text, mm-hmm. What would be your best reason that you could give me to believe in an old thunder god?
I couldn't give you any good reason. That's why I wouldn't suggest it.
But if I'm curious, let's say I bump into you and I'm interested because I see maybe something that you're doing that intrigues me as a Christian, and I maybe not familiar with that behavior, and I see how much credence you put into this and how much vigor you put into it, and I say, tell me more about this. How can I get involved in this?
Oh,
and you can't use the Bible.
So your previous question wasn't about me convincing you to believe in like Zeus or something? I thought that's what you were saying.
No.
Excuse me. Oh,
so from what I understand,
yeah, sorry about
Jesus is a thunder god. If I'm not, correct me if I'm wrong.
I don't. No, I don't think that's right.
Then this is your time to correct me.
You're wrong there. The Bible doesn't say that.
That's no problem.
Yeah. So okay, if you came to me and you saw how diligent I was in my faith and so on, and you were curious and you wanted good reasons to believe that Christianity is true, is that what you're asking? What reasons would I give?
Yeah, like how would you convince me that there's some supernatural power that you pray to and you ask things to? which I clearly don't. And you can't use a book to tell me about.
I would go through the evidence of the resurrection, and some of that, of course, does involve the New Testament, but we wouldn't be treating the New Testament. We wouldn't be examining these New Testament documents as
No, I apologize, Bram. We're coming to the end of the show.
inspired. We treat
no,
them as historical. Yeah.
What I said was let's not use anything of the book. Like, how would you, in your own words, if you could try a thought experiment with me, explain to me how the whole concept of the Christian God works without using the Bible?
Oh, okay. So now you're no longer asking what evidence could I give you that Christianity is true. Now you're just wanting me to explain to you what Christianity is. Sorry if I'm confused on this point.
Right. I've never been Christian before. I'm one of these cradle atheists, and I've just come across you, and I'm concerned for your safety because I see you talking to yourself with your hands clasped together, and I'm not sure what's going on because you're praying, for lack of a better term, and you're saying things. You're talking about spirits and ghosts and afterlives and things which I'm not familiar with, and I ask you.
I don't know about that.
Well, I might have Christianity wrong. That's my whole point. My whole point would be I might have this whole thing wrong.
So you want me to clarify Christianity to you?
No, I'm saying in your own words, without using the Bible, try and explain to me how the God of Christianity is something that's worthy of believing in.
Well, I would say that if the God of Christianity is real, then it matters everything because you were made in his image. He's a holy God. We have all fallen short before him. And the only way we can achieve reconciliation and be in a relationship with this God is through accepting by faith, and I'm using pistis here, the atoning work of his son on the cross.
Okay.
And Jesus was sent as by God as a way to reconcile us to God.
Okay. Sounds a bit far-fetched, but I appreciate it. Oz, thank you, man.
I'm sure it does in that little pithy.
Yeah, it comes across a little bit far-fetched, but I do appreciate your conviction in it. You're convincing, and I'll tell you that. And you're a very nice young man, Bram. I do appreciate you, and I love your phone calls on the call-in show.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, man, appreciate it.
Oh, I think you're on mute again.
Oh, of course I am. The 4-hour
God
marathon.
damn it!
God fuck. It's a running joke. Yeah, so we're gonna do Q&A, but Bram, we're at 3 hours, so okay. I'm not gonna do Q&A. Next time you come on, we'll make sure we do Q&A.
All right.
Pasta Mike has a sexy voice. It's all that chocolate covered pasta he eats. Chocolate covered pasta. That sounds disgusting.
You positive no Q&A?
What's that?
You positive you don't want to do Q&A?
I mean, we can, but most of them I've lost the questions now because we've been going so long because they disappear after a while in my chat. Gotcha. If
we can have Bram back on for his own Q&A show. We can have him. We can have him on. He can. How about next call-in show? He can call, and we can just ask him questions from the chat.
Okay. Yep.
Cool.
We could do that, and then backstage we talked about it. But if Bram, if you're interested, you can come back on and you can ask Jeff and I the questions that we talked about. You know, as far as what were some of the reasons we walked away from faith and religion? Why? What did it? What caused it? How did we get to where we're at now? Mm-hmm. That kind of thing. It'd be interesting conversation doing that, and then you don't have to worry about getting attacked by the atheists. But one last time before we go, Bram, if you want to let everybody know where they can find you, if you want, about your music, your band, all that fun stuff.
Cool. Thanks, guys, for having me on. It was a hostile environment, but I enjoy it. My TikTok is, I have a Christian apologetics TikTok, and it's at Bram Rawlings 1. And Oh, thank you, Shannon Q, for saying that. And I have an Instagram where I don't post Christian apologetics. I post guitar videos. I'm also a guitar player. And that's at Bram Rawlings without the one. It's been fun. I have to do some research on Bigfoot now. So, and by the way, I was not a priori rejecting Bigfoot evidence. I was just saying I don't know actually parallels. So there we go.
Holy. There it is. There it is.
Yeah.
Bram, it's a sealed deal right there.
I can't argue with that.
You are now an eyewitness.
I am. All right.
No, but we appreciate you, man. And for everybody that's been in the chat tonight, you guys have been awesome all night long. And just remember, sometimes we have people in here. We can agree to disagree, and if we can keep it polite and keep it cool on screen, for the love of all of their gods, you guys should be able to do it in the chat room too. But no, we appreciate it. We are the Atheist Roundtable, and next time we're live, we'll catch you then. Peace out. Thanks, Bram.
All right. Thank you. See y'all.
All right, Cousin Tony, here you go. Gosh, your skin and bones. So hungry, I'm sure. Oh.